I got my own brother kicked out of the family for something he didn't do, and I'd do it again. The phone woke me at 6 a.m., and I knew something was wrong before I even answered. My mother Aitana's name lit up the screen, and when I picked up, her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand her. "Someone stole the retirement fund," she said. "Every penny your father and I saved. Gone." I sat up in bed trying to make sense of what she was telling me. 30 years of savings, their whole future, just disappeared. "Mom, slow down," I said. "What do you mean stolen?" But she was already crying too hard to explain anything else, so I told her I was on my way and threw on whatever clothes I could find. The drive to my parents' house took about 20 minutes, and I spent every one of them trying to figure out how something like this could even happen. They weren't careless people. They had passwords and security questions and all the things you're supposed to have. When I pulled into their driveway, I counted 6 other cars already parked along the street. The whole family had beaten me there. I walked through the front door, and the living room felt like a courtroom where the trial was already over. My brother Chadwick sat in the corner with his head down, not looking at anyone. He seemed smaller somehow, like he was trying to disappear into the couch cushions. My Uncle Dominic paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, his face red and his hands moving while he talked. He was always the loudest person in any room, but today, he seemed especially worked up. My mother sat next to my father on the love seat, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that was already falling apart. Everyone else stood around like they were waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. "It had to be someone with access to the account," Dominic said, stopping his pacing to point at no one in particular. "And we all know Chadwick's been struggling with money." The room got quiet in that way where everyone's thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to say it out loud. I looked at my brother, and he finally lifted his head. His eyes met mine, and I could see how scared he was. Chadwick had made some bad choices in his 20s, got into some debt, had to borrow money from our parents more than once. But that was years ago. He'd been doing better since then. He had a steady job now and his own apartment. The idea that he would steal from our parents felt wrong to me in a way I couldn't explain yet. Chadwick looked up at me with desperate eyes. "I didn't take anything," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You have to believe me." Nobody responded. My mother wouldn't even look at him. My father stared at the floor like it might have answers. Dominic crossed his arms and shook his head like he'd already made up his mind about everything. The silence in that room was heavier than anything I'd felt in a long time. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, because someone needed to start asking real questions instead of just throwing blame around. "Everything," my mother said quietly. "The retirement account, the savings, even the emergency fund. Over $200,000, Harry. All of it moved out over the past 3 months. 3 months. That meant someone had been doing this slowly, carefully. Someone who knew how to avoid getting caught too fast. That didn't sound like my brother at all. Chadwick was a lot of things, but patient wasn't one of them. If he was desperate enough to steal from our parents, he would have grabbed everything at once and dealt with the problems later. This felt different. This felt planned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. I'd been added to the family accounts years ago as a backup in case something happened to my parents. At the time, it seemed like just a smart thing to do. Now I was grateful for it because it meant I could see exactly what happened without waiting for someone to show me. I scrolled through the transfer records, looking at each one carefully. The amounts were different every time, ranging from a few $100s to several thousand, but they all came from the same place. The device ID was listed right there in the security log, and I recognized it right away, because I'd helped set it up myself. "The transfers all came from the family computer," I said out loud. Everyone in the room turned to look at me, the one in Dominic's office at the family business. For just a second, something changed in my uncle's face. A small flicker behind his eyes before he got control of himself again. "That computer's been there for 10 years, he said quickly. "Anyone in the family could have used it." I kept looking at the records on my phone, at the device ID that tied everything back to that office. The office that Dominic kept locked. The computer that sat 10 feet from his desk. The same computer that my uncle used every single day to run the family business. I didn't say anything else right then, but I made a mental note of how fast he was to point fingers at my brother, and how hard he was working to make sure nobody looked anywhere else. The moment I mentioned Dominic's office, he shut me down fast. "You're just protecting your little brother like you always do," he said, and his voice had that reasonable tone that made me sound crazy for even suggesting anything. "You can't see the truth because you're too close to it." I looked around the room for someone to back me up, but my own mother was nodding along with him like everything he said made perfect sense. So I kept my mouth shut for the moment, but I started digging. Dominic had been the one pushing hardest to blame Chadwick from the very start. That felt wrong to me. I made copies of everything I could find on my phone before anyone thought to delete the evidence. The next family meeting was scheduled for 4 days from now. I planned to be ready. The next 4 days felt like the longest of my life, and I spent most of them on the phone trying to get someone in my family to listen to me. I started with my aunt on my mother's side, thinking maybe someone outside of Dominic's direct influence would be willing to hear what I had to say. But the second I brought up the computer in his office, she cut me off. "Dominic already explained everything," she said with this tired sigh like I was a child who couldn't accept the obvious. "Why are you still defending Chadwick?" I tried to explain about the device ID and how the transfers were all linked to that one computer, but she wasn't interested. She told me that Dominic had called her the day before and walked her through the whole situation. According to him, Chadwick had been using the office computer whenever he visited the business, which wasn't even true because Chadwick hadn't set foot in that building in over a year. But my aunt believed it, because Dominic said it. And that was apparently enough for her. I called 3 more relatives that day and got the same response every single time. My uncle on my father's side said he felt bad for me because I was clearly struggling to accept the truth about my own brother. My cousin, who lived 2 towns over, told me that Dominic had already warned her I might call and that I would probably try to make up stories to protect Chadwick. The word warned stuck with me because it meant Dominic wasn't just defending himself. He was actively working to shut me down before I could even open my mouth. Every conversation ended the same way, with someone telling me to let it go and stop making things worse for the family. By the end of the second day, I felt like I was screaming into a wall that kept getting thicker. The family meeting was still 2 days away, and Dominic had already won the argument without me even being in the room. I drove to my parents' house on the 3rd day because I needed to see my mother face to face. Maybe if I could sit down with her and show her what I found, she would at least consider that something wasn't right. But when I got there, the house was full of people again. Dominic was holding court in the kitchen, talking to a group of relatives about how sorry he felt for my parents and how hard this whole situation had been on everyone. I stood in the doorway watching him play the concerned family member, and it made my stomach turn. That's when my cousin Vicente appeared at my side. He was younger than me by a few years, quiet most of the time, and usually stayed out of family drama. But he grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward the back hallway where nobody else could hear us. "I believe you're onto something," he whispered, and his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen like he was scared someone might catch us talking. "But Dominic's been telling everyone you're in denial. He says you can't accept that Chadwick did this because you two have always been close." I felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time in days. At least one person in this family could see through the act. "Vicente, the transfers all came from his computer, the one in his locked office." "How is nobody asking questions about that?" Vicente shook his head slowly. "Because he has an answer for everything. He told people that Chadwick used to come by the office sometimes and that he must have done it when nobody was watching. And everyone believes him because he's Dominic. He's been running the family business for 20 years. People trust him." I wanted to punch a wall. Dominic had spent decades building up his reputation as the reliable one, the responsible one, the guy who always had the family's best interests at heart. And now he was using all that trust to destroy my brother's life. Vicente squeezed my arm and looked me in the eyes. "Be careful, Harry. I don't know what's really going on here, but Dominic is 3 steps ahead of you. Whatever you're planning, make sure you have proof that can't be denied." Then he walked away and rejoined the group in the kitchen like we'd never spoken at all. I stayed in that hallway for a minute trying to figure out my next move. Vicente was right about one thing. I needed better proof. The device ID alone wasn't enough because Dominic had already created a story to explain it away. I needed something that couldn't be twisted or denied. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and went through the bank records again, line by line, looking for anything I might have missed the first time. I pulled up the timestamps on each transfer and compared them to what I remembered about Chadwick's schedule. My brother worked a regular job with set hours, and I knew for a fact that he'd been at work during some of the times the transfers supposedly happened. But when I looked closer at the records, something seemed off. The timestamps had been changed. I could see it in the metadata, in the small details that most people wouldn't know to look for. Someone had gone into the records and altered the times to make it look like the transfers happened when Chadwick was at our parents' house for dinner or visiting on a weekend. The original times were different. The original times were during business hours, when Chadwick would have been at his job across town. Someone had deliberately made my brother look guilty by changing the evidence after the fact. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't just about stealing money anymore. This was about framing someone for a crime they didn't commit. And the only person who had access to those records, the only person who could have made those changes, was the same person who controlled the family business and that locked office. Dominic wasn't just a thief. He was setting up my brother to take the fall for everything. The next morning, I drove back to my parents' house with my laptop. I had screenshots of everything, the original timestamps and the altered ones, laid out side by side so anyone could see the difference. I found my mother Aitana in the kitchen making coffee, and she looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since my grandfather passed away. The stress of the past week was wearing her down, and part of me felt bad for adding to her burden. But I couldn't let Chadwick go down for something he didn't do. "Mom, I need to show you something," I said, setting the laptop on the counter. "Just give me 5 minutes, please." She turned to look at me, and her expression was already closed off. "Harry, I don't want to do this again. I know, but this is important. Someone changed the records to make Chadwick look guilty. The timestamps were altered after the transfers happened. I can prove it." I started to turn the laptop toward her, but she held up her hand before I could even open the file. "Dominic already told us you'd try this," she said, and her voice was so sad it almost broke me. "He said you'd fabricate evidence to protect your brother. He said you wouldn't be able to help yourself because you've always taken care of Chadwick, even when he didn't deserve it." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My own mother was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one hurting the family by refusing to accept the obvious truth. "Mom, I didn't fabricate anything. These are real records. The metadata doesn't lie." She shook her head and turned back to her coffee. "I can't do this, Harry. I can't keep going back and forth while your father and I are trying to figure out how to survive without our retirement. Dominic has been helping us through this. He's been there for us. And all you've done is make accusations and cause more pain." I stood there with my laptop in my hands, feeling like I'd already lost. Dominic had gotten to everyone before me. He'd poisoned the well so thoroughly that anything I said would just confirm his story about me being in denial. I drove home in silence, trying to figure out what to do next. That night, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chadwick, and when I read it, my heart sank even lower than I thought possible. "They're talking about pressing charges," the message said, "against me, for something I didn't do." I called him immediately. He picked up on the first ring, and I could hear how scared he was just from the way he said hello. "Who told you that?" I asked. "Dad called me an hour ago. He said Dominic convinced him that pressing charges is the only way to get the money back. They think if they take me to court, I'll crack and tell them where I hid everything." His voice was shaking. "Harry, I don't have their money. I never touched it. But nobody believes me except you." I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Dominic wasn't just going to let Chadwick take the blame. He was going to send my brother to prison to cover up his own crime. And if I didn't find a way to stop him, it was going to work. Dominic had poisoned everyone against me before I even opened my mouth, turning my own family into witnesses for his defense instead of mine. He knew exactly what I'd find in those records, which meant he knew exactly what he was hiding and had already built his walls before I could knock them down. Vicente was the only one who would listen, and even he was scared to speak up in front of the rest of the family. But I noticed something in those altered timestamps that Dominic had missed. The changes came from the same device that made the original transfers, which meant the digital fingerprints were identical. And I could prove it if I had the right software and 10 minutes alone with his computer. The family business had a board meeting scheduled for Friday morning at 10. Everyone would be in the conference room going over quarterly reports. Everyone except me, since Dominic had already convinced them I shouldn't be involved in sensitive family matters until the situation with Chadwick was resolved. I called Vicente that night and told him what I needed. At first, he was quiet on the other end of the line, and I could tell he was weighing the risks against what we might find. "You want me to keep Dominic busy while you break into his office?" he said. And it wasn't really a question. "I'm not breaking in," I said. "The office is in a building my family owns. I have every right to be there." Vicente laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Try telling that to Dominic when he catches you going through his computer." I waited while he thought it over. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the phone, and I knew he was scared. We both were. But then he said, "Fine, I'll do it. But you better find something good in there, Harry, because if you don't, we're both going to look like idiots and Chadwick is still going to prison." I told him I understood the stakes, and we made a plan for Friday morning. Vicente would show up to the board meeting a few minutes early and corner Dominic with questions about the budget reports. He said he could keep him talking for at least 15 minutes if he played it right, maybe longer if he pretended to be confused about some of the numbers. That would give me enough time to get in, find what I needed, and get out before anyone noticed I was there. The night before the meeting, I barely slept at all. I kept running through everything that could go wrong, all the ways this could blow up in my face and make things even worse for Chadwick. But I also kept thinking about my brother sitting alone in his apartment, waiting to find out if his own family was going to send him to prison for a crime he didn't commit. That thought was enough to push me forward no matter how scared I was. Friday morning came too fast and not fast enough at the same time. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the family business so nobody would see it in the lot. The building was a small office complex that my father and Dominic had started together almost 25 years ago, back when they were young and still believed they could build something that would last for generations. Now it was just another piece of evidence in my uncle's betrayal. I watched from across the street as people started arriving for the meeting. My father's car pulled in first, then a few of the other board members who weren't family but had been with the company for years. Dominic showed up at 9:45, right on schedule, driving the fancy car he'd bought last year. At the time, I remember thinking he must have gotten a good deal on it somewhere. Now I wondered how much of my parents' retirement fund was sitting in that garage. Vicente texted me at 9:58. "Going in now. He's heading for the conference room. You have 15 minutes, maybe 20 if I can stretch it." I took a deep breath and walked across the street like I belonged there, which technically I did. The back entrance to the building was around the side, past the dumpsters and the employee parking spots. I'd used it 100 times when I worked here during college summers, and the code on the door hadn't changed in over a decade. 4721. The same code my father picked because it was my mother's birthday. The hallway was empty when I slipped inside. I could hear voices coming from the conference room at the other end of the building, muffled by distance and closed doors. Dominic's office was on the second floor, up the back stairs and to the left. I moved quickly but tried not to run because running would look suspicious if anyone happened to see me. The door to his office was closed but not locked. I turned the handle and pushed it open, half expecting an alarm to go off or someone to shout at me from down the hall, but nothing happened. The room was dark and quiet, with morning light coming through the blinds and landing in stripes across Dominic's big wooden desk. I closed the door behind me and went straight for the computer. The screen was dark, but when I moved the mouse, it lit up immediately. No password screen, no security prompt, just Dominic's desktop with all his files and folders sitting right there waiting for someone to look at them. His arrogance had worked in my favor. He never thought anyone would actually check because he'd spent so much time convincing everyone that there was nothing to check. Why bother locking your computer when you've already made sure nobody suspects you of anything? I sat down in his chair and started looking through the files. Most of them were normal business stuff, invoices and contracts and emails about shipments. But there was one folder tucked away in a corner of the screen that didn't match the others. It was labeled with a string of random numbers and letters, the kind of thing that would look like a system file to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. I clicked on it and my breath caught in my throat. The original transfer records were all there, laid out in neat rows with dates and amounts and account numbers. But these weren't the same records I'd seen before. These were the real ones, the ones that hadn't been altered to frame my brother. And they showed exactly where the money had gone. An offshore account, with Dominic's name on it. He'd been siphoning from my parents for months, taking a little bit at a time so nobody would notice until it was too late. The amounts matched what my mother had told me was missing, down to the last penny. Over $200,000 of my parents' retirement, sitting in an account that my uncle controlled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run downstairs and drag Dominic out of that conference room and make him explain himself in front of everyone. But I knew that wouldn't work. I needed proof that couldn't be denied, evidence that Dominic couldn't explain away with another lie. I pulled a flash drive out of my pocket and plugged it into the computer. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it twice. The files were big and the transfer seemed to take forever, each second stretching out while I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. 70%, 80%, 90%. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to fly open any second. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, moving fast, getting closer. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The progress bar hit 95%. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I yanked the flash drive out of the computer and shoved it in my pocket just as Dominic's voice carried through the door. "Who left my office unlocked?" he said, and he sounded annoyed rather than suspicious. Like this was just another small problem in his perfect day. I heard the doorknob start to turn. I moved faster than I'd ever moved in my life, crossing the room in 3 steps and pushing through the back door that led to the emergency stairs. The door clicked shut behind me just as I heard Dominic walk into his office. I stood on the landing with my back pressed against the wall, trying to control my breathing so he wouldn't hear me through the thin door. My legs felt like they were made of water. The flash drive in my pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to Dominic moving around in his office, opening drawers and shuffling papers. Then I heard him mutter something I couldn't make out, and his footsteps moved away from the back door toward the front of the room. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I went down those stairs as fast as I could without making noise, and I didn't stop moving until I was back in my car 2 blocks away. My hands were still shaking when I pulled out of the parking spot and started driving home. I had everything I needed to save my brother and destroy my uncle. The question was how to use it without giving Dominic another chance to spin the story in his favor. I sat in my car with proof that would save my brother and destroy my uncle, but Dominic had spent weeks making me look unstable. If I just showed up with a flash drive, he'd claim I planted everything. I needed witnesses who couldn't be dismissed. I pulled out my phone and called Vicente. "I have it all," I said when he picked up. "But I need this to happen somewhere Dominic can't control." Vicente was quiet for a moment, then said, "Where?" I thought about it and realized the answer was obvious. My parents' anniversary dinner was Saturday. The whole family would be there. Dominic would be there, confident and untouchable. He had no idea I was about to return the favor for every lie he told about my brother. Saturday came faster than I expected, and I spent most of the day going over my plan again and again until I had every detail memorized. The flash drive sat in my pocket like a small weight that kept reminding me what was at stake. I got to my parents' house about an hour before the dinner was supposed to start, and I was surprised by how nice everything looked. My mother had set up the dining room with the good tablecloth, the one she only brought out for special occasions, and there were flowers in the center of the table that must have cost more than she usually spent on things like that. Candles were lit everywhere, giving the whole room this warm glow that made it feel like nothing bad had ever happened in this family. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was really there. The anniversary dinner started beautifully, with my father helping my mother into her chair like they were on a first date instead of celebrating decades of marriage. My parents looked happy for the first time in weeks, and watching them smile at each other made my chest feel tight because I knew what I was about to do might ruin this night forever. But then I thought about Chadwick, and the tightness turned into something harder. The other guests started arriving one by one, aunts and uncles and cousins filing through the front door with cards and small gifts wrapped in shiny paper. Everyone hugged my parents and said the things you say at anniversary parties, stuff like, "You two are an inspiration," and "Here's to many more years together." I stood near the back of the room watching everyone come in, and I noticed the moment Dominic walked through the door. He was wearing a nice suit, nicer than anyone else, and he carried a bottle of expensive wine that he presented to my mother with this big smile on his face. "For the happy couple," he said, and my mother actually teared up a little as she thanked him. I wanted to throw up. Vicente caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. He knew what was coming. He was the only one who did. I nodded back and tried to keep my face calm, even though my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. The dinner itself was catered, which surprised me because my mother usually liked to cook everything herself for family events. But I guess after everything that happened with the money, she didn't have the energy for that anymore. The food was good, though, some kind of chicken with vegetables and potatoes, and everyone sat around the big table talking and laughing like this was just another family gathering. I kept looking at the empty chair at the end of the table, the one where Chadwick should have been sitting. Before dinner started, I'd asked my mother why he wasn't there. She got this uncomfortable look on her face and said, "He was asked not to come. It's too uncomfortable right now. Until this is resolved, I just think it's better if he stays away." The way she said it, like Chadwick was some kind of problem that needed to be dealt with instead of her own son, made me so angry I had to walk away before I said something I couldn't take back. So there we were, this big, happy family celebration, and nobody would even talk about the fact that my brother was sitting alone somewhere wondering if he was going to prison for something he didn't do. Dominic sat at the head of the table like he belonged there, telling stories and making everyone laugh, while my parents beamed at him like he was the best thing that ever happened to their family. About halfway through the meal, Dominic stood up and tapped his wine glass with his fork to get everyone's attention. The room got quiet and all eyes turned to him. He held up his glass and cleared his throat. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, and his voice was smooth and confident like always. "To family, to trust, to standing together when times get hard." He paused and looked directly at me as he said that last part, and there was something in his eyes that felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to say something in front of everyone. "This family has been through a lot lately," Dominic continued, still looking at me. "But we're strong. We stick together, and we don't let anything tear us apart." Everyone raised their glasses and drank, and my mother reached over to squeeze Dominic's hand like he had just said the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. I took a small sip of my wine and set the glass down. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The scraping sound it made against the floor seemed way too loud in the quiet room. "I have something to share," I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. "About the missing money." The mood in the room changed instantly. I could feel it like a cold wind blowing through an open window. My mother's face fell and my father looked down at his plate. Some of my cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances like they wished they could be anywhere else. But Dominic's smile didn't waver. If anything, it got wider. He set his wine glass down and looked at me with this expression that was part pity and part disappointment, like I was a little kid who wouldn't stop bringing up a dead pet at Christmas dinner. "Harry," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made me want to scream. "We've been over this. Let's not ruin your parents' evening with more conspiracy theories." A few people around the table nodded, and I heard someone whisper something I couldn't quite make out. My mother reached across the table toward me. "Please, Harry," she said quietly. "Not tonight. This is supposed to be a happy occasion." I looked at her face, at the pleading in her eyes, and for 1 second I almost sat back down. Every face at that table was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one hurting the family by refusing to accept the obvious truth. The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago, and I could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on me. Dominic was still smiling, still so confident that he had won this before it even started. He thought he knew exactly how this would go. He thought I would back down like I always did, that I would mumble an apology and sit back in my chair and let him keep running his story. But then I thought about Chadwick, alone at his apartment right now, probably staring at his phone waiting for news about whether his own family was going to destroy his life. I thought about the flash drive in my pocket with all the proof I needed. I thought about how Dominic had looked my father in the eye and lied about everything, and how he was going to keep lying until someone stopped him. I didn't sit down. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive, holding it up so everyone could see. "I'm not asking anyone to believe me," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could even though my heart was pounding. "I'm asking you to look at the evidence that Dominic didn't want you to see." The room went completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Dominic's smile finally cracked, just a little bit around the edges, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something like fear in his eyes. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and set it on the table in front of me, my hands surprisingly steady now that the moment was finally here. The flash drive clicked into the USB port, and I opened the files, turning the screen so everyone could see. Bank records filled the display, row after row of transfers with dates and amounts and account numbers that told the whole story. "These are the original records from Dominic's computer," I said. "The ones that show where the money really went." My mother leaned forward to look at the screen, and I watched her eyes move across the numbers. The bank records filled the screen, showing everything I had found in that office. The offshore account with its long string of numbers, the altered timestamps that had been changed to frame my brother, and right there at the bottom of each transfer, clear as day, was Dominic's digital signature on every single one. I scrolled slowly so everyone could see, pointing at each piece of evidence as it appeared. "This is the account where all the money went," I said. "Over $200,000 transferred in small amounts over 3 months. And this signature right here, this digital code, it can only come from one person, the person who set up the account in the first place." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me. My aunts and uncles were staring at the screen with their mouths open. My father had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he might fall over if he let go. And Dominic, for the first time since I'd known him, looked like a man who had just realized he wasn't as smart as he thought he was, but he recovered fast, faster than I expected. He slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to make the dishes rattle, and when he spoke, his voice came out way too loud for the small room. "Those are fabricated," he said, and there was this edge to his words that I'd never heard before. "Harry's been trying to frame me since the beginning. I told all of you this would happen. I warned you he would make up evidence to protect his brother, and here he is doing exactly what I said he would do." He looked around the table at all the faces watching him, trying to find someone who would nod along like they always did. But nobody was nodding this time. Nobody was agreeing with him or shaking their heads at me. They were all just staring at the screen with these looks on their faces like they didn't know what to believe anymore. My mother was still leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the numbers. I watched her face change as she looked at the account information, really looked at it for the first time without Dominic's voice in her ear telling her what to think. Her forehead wrinkled and she brought her hand up to her mouth like she was trying to hold something back. Then she turned to look at Dominic, and her voice was small and confused when she spoke. "That's your account number, Dominic," she said, and the words hung in the air like something heavy that nobody wanted to catch. "I recognize it from when you helped us set up the business. You wrote it down for me on that little notepad I keep in the kitchen. I still have it somewhere." Dominic's face went through about 5 different emotions in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, then anger, then fear, then something that looked almost like panic before he got control of himself again. He turned away from my mother and looked at my father instead, and I could see him switching tactics, trying to figure out a new way to spin this. "You're really going to believe this?" he said to my father, and now his voice had this hurt sound to it like he was the one being wronged. "After everything I've done for this family? After 20 years of building this business together, of being there for every birthday and every holiday, of helping out whenever anyone needed anything, you're going to throw all that away because Harry copied some files onto a flash drive?" My father didn't answer right away. He just sat there looking at the screen, then at Dominic, then back at the screen again. His face was hard to read, like he was having a whole conversation with himself inside his head that none of us could hear. I could see how much this was hurting him, finding out that his own brother might have done something this terrible. But I could also see something else starting to grow behind his eyes, something that looked a lot like the anger I'd been feeling for weeks. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and I was starting to worry that Dominic's words had worked, that my father was going to choose family loyalty over the truth sitting right in front of him. But then Vicente pushed his chair back and stood up from the table, and everyone turned to look at him. My cousin wasn't a loud person. He usually sat in the background at family events, listening more than talking, staying out of arguments whenever he could. So when he stood up and cleared his throat, people paid attention in a way they might not have for someone else. His hands were shaking a little, and I could tell how hard this was for him, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I was with Harry when he found these files," Vicente said, looking straight at Dominic with more courage than I'd ever seen from him. "On your computer, in your office, at the family business, during the board meeting on Friday." A murmur went through the room as people started connecting the dots. Dominic's eyes went wide and he took a small step back from the table like Vicente's words had physically pushed him. My cousin kept going, his voice getting stronger with each sentence. "I kept you busy in the conference room while Harry went upstairs. He didn't plan anything. He didn't fabricate anything. He just copied the files that were already there, the ones you thought nobody would ever look for because you'd convinced everyone that Chadwick was guilty." The room exploded into noise. Everyone started talking at once, asking questions and demanding answers, and looking back and forth between Dominic and the laptop screen. My aunt was saying something about how she always thought Dominic spent too much money on things he couldn't afford. My uncle on my father's side kept repeating, "I can't believe this," over and over like a broken record. And through it all, Dominic just stood there with his mouth opening and closing, trying to find words that would fix this but coming up empty. I watched him start to crumble, and I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness. Part of me had hoped I was wrong about all of it, that there was some explanation that would make sense without destroying our family. But there wasn't. The evidence was right there on the screen, and Vicente had just confirmed exactly how I got it. Dominic was caught, and everyone in the room knew it. My mother turned to face him fully, and her expression had changed from confusion to something much colder. "You came to our house the day after we found out," she said slowly, like she was putting together a puzzle in her head and not liking the picture that was forming. "You sat in our living room and you pointed at Chadwick. You told us he must have done it because he needed money. You made us believe our own son was a thief." Her voice cracked on the last word, and my father reached over to take her hand. "All this time," she continued, "while we were talking about pressing charges against our own child, you knew. You knew exactly where that money was because you were the one who took it." Dominic held up his hands like he was trying to stop traffic. "Aitana, listen to me," he started. But my mother wasn't finished. "Don't you dare say my name like we're still family," she said, and her voice had gotten louder than I'd ever heard it. "You were going to let my son go to prison for something you did. What kind of person does that?" I stood there watching this unfold, feeling like I was in a dream where everything was finally going the way it should have gone from the beginning. All those days of being told I was crazy, of being shut down every time I tried to explain what I'd found, of watching my brother get pushed out of the family for a crime he didn't commit. All of it was worth it for this moment, for seeing the truth finally come out in front of everyone who had doubted me. My father stood up from his chair, and the room got quiet again. He was a big man, my father, and when he moved, people tended to pay attention. He walked around the table until he was standing right in front of Dominic, close enough that they could have touched if either one of them reached out. The two brothers faced each other, and I could see 20 years of history passing between them. All the business meetings and family dinners, all the holidays and birthday parties, all the trust that my father had placed in this man who turned out to be nothing like he pretended to be. Dominic's face had gone from angry to desperate, and I could see him trying to figure out what to say, what magic words might make this all go away. But there were no magic words. There was just the truth, sitting on my laptop screen for everyone to see. My father's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but it carried through the silent room like thunder. "I want to hear you say it," he said. "I want to hear you admit what you did." The room split in half right in front of me. Some people were looking at Dominic with horror on their faces, like they were seeing him for the first time and didn't like what they saw. Others looked at me like I'd just set off a bomb at a birthday party, like I was the one who had ruined everything by bringing this up on such a special night. Dominic grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed for the door, moving fast like he couldn't stand to be in that room for another second. "I don't have to listen to this," he said over his shoulder, his voice trying to sound confident, but coming out shaky instead. "When you all come to your senses, you know where to find me." But before he could reach the front door, My father moved to block his path. The two brothers stood face to face for the first time without all the pretending, without the masks they'd been wearing for each other all these years. 20 years of family dinners and business partnerships and holiday cards hung in the air between them, all of it balanced on whatever happened in the next 30 seconds. My father spoke first, and his voice was low and hard in a way I'd never heard from him before. "You told me my own son was a thief," he said, and each word landed like a punch. "You looked me in the eye and lied." The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Everyone was watching, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. Dominic stood there facing my father, and for a moment it looked like he might try to keep up the act, might try one more time to spin some story that would make all of this go away. But then something changed in his face. The smooth confidence that he'd worn like a second skin for as long as I could remember just melted away. And what was left underneath was something ugly and raw and honest, for maybe the first time ever. His shoulders dropped and his jaw got tight, and when he spoke again, his voice wasn't smooth anymore. It was bitter and angry, and full of something that sounded almost like hate. "I built that business," Dominic said, and he jabbed his finger toward my father's chest. "I made this family what it is. 20 years I spent turning that little company into something real, something that actually made money, something that put food on all of your tables. And you think I was going to let it all go to waste on your retirement?" The words hung in the air like poison, and I watched my father's face change as he realized what his brother was really saying. This wasn't just about stolen money anymore. This was about resentment that had been building for decades, about Dominic feeling like he deserved more than he got, about all the times he smiled at family dinners while hating everyone around him. My mother stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the table, and her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She looked smaller than usual somehow, like the weight of what was happening had pushed her down a few inches. But her voice was clear when she spoke, even though it was barely above a whisper. "You stole from us," she said, and there was no anger in her tone, just this deep, sad thing that was almost worse. "And you were going to let Chadwick go to prison for it." She said my brother's name like it hurt her mouth to form the word, and I thought about all the times over the past few weeks when she'd refused to look at Chadwick, when she'd believed the worst about her own son because Dominic told her to. All that pain, all that broken trust between a mother and her child, and it was all because of the man standing in front of us right now. Dominic turned to face my mother, and there was no apology in his expression. No guilt, no shame. Just this cold calculation, like he was still trying to figure out how to talk his way out of this, even though everyone in the room had seen the proof. "Chadwick's weak," he said, and the words came out flat and matter-of-fact, like he was explaining something obvious to a child who couldn't understand basic math. "He would have survived prison. He's young. He would have gotten out eventually and moved on with his life. But if people found out about the account, if they saw where the money really went, the business would collapse. Everyone would lose everything." He looked around the room at all the faces staring back at him, and for a second I thought I saw something like genuine belief in his eyes, like he actually thought what he was saying made sense, like he honestly believed that sending my brother to prison was the reasonable choice, the smart choice, the one that protected the family better than telling the truth ever could. "I was trying to save us," Dominic continued, and his voice got louder like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "All of us, the business, the jobs, everything we built together. If that money came to light, if people saw the hole in the accounts, investors would have run, clients would have left, the whole thing would have fallen apart, and everyone in this room would have lost their income, their security, everything they depend on. I made a hard choice. I did what had to be done." The silence that followed was heavy and thick, and I could see people around the room trying to process what they were hearing. My uncle was basically admitting to everything, but he was doing it in a way that made him sound like the hero of his own story. Like stealing $200,000 from his own brother and framing his nephew for the crime was just smart business sense. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped forward until I was standing right next to my father, facing Dominic head on. My hands were shaking a little, but my voice came out steady, and I made sure to look him straight in the face when I spoke. "You didn't do this to protect the family," I said. "You did it because you were scared of getting caught." Dominic's mouth opened like he was going to argue, but I kept going before he could get a word out. "You've been skimming from the business for years, haven't you? The fancy car, the expensive suits, all those vacations you took that nobody else could afford. That money had to come from somewhere. And when the amounts got big enough that someone might notice, you panicked. You needed a way to cover your tracks, and Chadwick was the easiest target because you'd already spent years making everyone think he was irresponsible." I could see the truth of it landing on faces around the room. My aunt's eyes went wide, and she looked over at the laptop screen still showing all those bank records. My cousin, who lived 2 towns over, put her hand over her mouth like she was going to be sick. Even Vicente, who had known most of this already, looked shocked at hearing it all laid out so clearly. Dominic's face had gone red, and I could see a vein pulsing in his forehead. He looked around the room at all those faces that had trusted him for so long, that had nodded along with every lie he told, that had turned against Chadwick on his word alone. And now those same faces were looking at him like they didn't even know who he was. "You don't understand," he said, but his voice had lost all its power. He sounded desperate now, small and scared in a way I'd never seen from him before. "None of you understand what it takes to keep something like this running. The pressure, the responsibility, everyone depending on you to make the right calls. I gave everything to this family. Everything. And this is how you repay me?" My father hadn't moved since Dominic started talking. He just stood there like a wall, blocking the path to the door, his arms crossed over his chest and his face like stone. I'd seen my father angry before, but this was different. This was something deeper than anger. This was the look of a man who had just watched everything he believed about his own brother turn to ash right in front of him. "You gave everything," my father repeated slowly, and his voice was so cold it made me shiver even though I wasn't the one he was talking to. "You took our retirement. You tried to destroy our son. You lied to our faces for months while we cried ourselves to sleep wondering how we were going to survive. And you call that giving?" Dominic took a step back, bumping into the edge of the dining table. Some of the dishes rattled and a wine glass tipped over, spilling red across my mother's nice white tablecloth like blood spreading across snow. He looked around the room one more time, searching for someone, anyone, who might still be on his side. But there was no one. Every face in that room had closed against him. Even the relatives who had been nodding along with him just an hour ago were looking away now, unable to meet his eyes, embarrassed that they had ever believed his lies in the first place. "This isn't fair," Dominic said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I'm your brother. We built that company together. You can't just throw away everything we have over some money." My mother made a sound that was almost like a laugh but had no humor in it at all. "Some money," she repeated. "Our entire future, our retirement, 30 years of saving every penny we could so we wouldn't have to worry when we got old. You call that some money?" She shook her head slowly, and when she looked at Dominic again, there was nothing left in her eyes but exhaustion and disgust. "I trusted you. I defended you to Harry when he tried to tell me the truth. I chose to believe you over my own son, over my own instincts, because I thought I knew who you were. I thought you were family." The word family seemed to hit Dominic harder than anything else that had been said. He flinched like someone had slapped him, and for just a second I saw something that might have been real emotion flash across his face, regret maybe, or shame, or just the pain of finally being seen for what he really was after so many years of hiding behind a mask. But then it was gone, replaced by that same hard, angry look he'd been wearing since his excuses stopped working. He straightened his jacket and lifted his chin, trying to hold on to whatever was left of his dignity, even though everyone in the room could see right through him now. "Fine," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold. "If that's how you want it. But don't come crying to me when the business falls apart and none of you know what to do. Don't call me when you realize you need my help to keep things running. I'm done saving people who don't appreciate what I've done for them." He turned toward the door like he was going to walk out on his own terms, like this was his choice instead of his punishment. But my father was still standing in the way, and he didn't move an inch. Instead, he reached over and opened the front door, letting in a rush of cool evening air that made the candles on the dining table flicker and dance. Then my father pointed to the street outside, and his voice was steady and final when he spoke. "Get out," he said, "and don't come back." Dominic stood there for a long moment, staring at his brother like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Like even after everything that had been said, some part of him expected my father to change his mind at the last second and tell him it was all okay, that they could work this out, that family was more important than money or truth or any of the other things that had just been thrown in his face. But my father didn't move. He just kept pointing at that open door, at the darkness waiting outside, at the end of everything Dominic had thought he could count on. And finally, after what felt like forever, Dominic walked through it. His footsteps echoed on the porch, then faded as he made his way down the driveway toward his fancy car that was probably bought with money he stole from us. Nobody said anything until we heard the engine start and the headlights sweep across the front windows as he backed out and drove away. Then my mother sat down heavily in the nearest chair and put her face in her hands, and my father closed the door and leaned against it like he needed something solid to hold him up. The anniversary dinner was ruined. The nice tablecloth was stained with wine, and the candles were burning down to nothing, and half the food on the table had gone cold while we were all too busy dealing with the truth to eat. But as I looked around at my family, at all the people who had finally seen what I'd been trying to show them for weeks, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe normally. Vicente came over and put his hand on my shoulder, and my mother looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Call your brother," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell him to come home."
During my exam, my gynecologist stopped mid-procedure and said, "Your husband deserves better than this body." I was in the most vulnerable position possible when Dr. Harrison said it while my feet were still in the stirrups, and the nurse was standing right there pretending to organize supplies. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" I tried to sit up, but he put his hand on my shoulder to keep me down. "I said your husband deserves better." I saw him in the waiting room. Handsome guy, athletic build, and here you are 40 pounds overweight, making no effort. It's sad, really. The nurse Catherine kept her eyes on her clipboard, but I could see her jaw clench. "Are you seriously commenting on my body during a medical exam?" I grabbed the paper gown tighter around me. "Doctor." Harrison pulled off his gloves with a snap. "I'm a doctor. It's my job to notice these things. You've gained 18 pounds since last year. Your husband gained 0. I checked when he brought you in for that UTI last month. The contrast is concerning." He wrote something on my chart. "I'm recommending you for nutritional counseling and a gym membership. Your insurance won't cover it, but your marriage might depend on it." I sat up despite his protests. "This is completely inappropriate." He laughed. Actually laughed while I was half naked on his exam table. "Inappropriate? I'm trying to save your marriage. You know what I see every day? Women who let themselves go, then act surprised when their husbands find younger models. Your husband's what, 32? The prime of his life. You're 35 and looking 45. Do the math." The nurse finally spoke. "Doctor Harrison, perhaps we should continue with the exam." He waved her off. "We're done here. Everything looks normal down there. Well, medically normal. Aesthetically, that's another story. Have you considered grooming? Your husband probably appreciates a certain maintenance level that you're not providing." He pulled out a business card. "This is my wife's salon. They do waxing. Tell them I sent you and they'll give you the desperate housewife discount." I snatched my clothes from the chair. "I need to get dressed. Please leave." But he kept talking while writing in my chart. "You know your husband was reading fitness magazines in the waiting room? Not good. When men start looking at perfect bodies in magazines, it means they're not satisfied with what they have at home. I'd say you have maybe 6 months before he starts wandering. Less if someone from his gym makes a move." He looked up at me. "Does he go to the gym a lot? Without you?" I was shaking with anger. "Get out of this room now." He stood but didn't leave. "I'm also noting that you declined the birth control prescription. Trying for a baby? Bad timing. Nothing kills a marriage faster than pregnancy weight on top of existing weight problems. Your husband will definitely cheat then. They always do. I've seen it hundreds of times." The nurse moved toward the door. "Dr. Harrison, we have other patients." He ignored her and pulled up something on his tablet. "Look at this. It's a study about marriage satisfaction correlated with weight gain. Women who gain more than 15 pounds in the first 5 years have a 70% higher divorce rate. You've gained 40 in 3 years. Statistically, your marriage is doomed unless you take action now." He showed me before and after photos on his tablet. "These are my other patients who took my advice. Losing the weight saved the marriage. This one's husband bought her a Tesla after she dropped 4 dress sizes. This one got a second honeymoon in Bali. What did your husband get you for your last anniversary?" I didn't answer, but he kept going. "Nothing special, right? Because why would he celebrate being married to someone who doesn't take care of herself?" The nurse Catherine suddenly stepped between us. "Dr. Harrison, I need to speak with you in the hall. Now." He looked annoyed but followed her out. I could hear her voice through the door. That was completely unethical. I got dressed as fast as possible and opened the door to find them still arguing. Other patients were watching from the waiting room. "Doctor." Harrison saw me and called out, "Remember what I said. 6 months maximum before he finds someone else." I walked past him toward the exit, but he followed. "I'm scheduling you for a follow-up in 3 months. We'll see if you've made any progress." My husband stood up from his chair in the waiting room looking confused. "Everything okay, doctor?" Harrison reached him first. "Just discussing some lifestyle changes your wife needs to make. For your sake." He clapped my husband on the shoulder. "You're a patient man. Not many guys would stick around with that kind of physical deterioration. Says a lot about your character." My husband pulled away from him. "What the hell are you talking about, doctor?" Harrison smiled. "Just medical observations. Your wife can fill you in, but between us man to man, you deserve better. My wife maintains herself beautifully even after 3 kids. Happy to give you her trainer's number if your wife won't use it." The waiting room was dead silent. Every patient and staff member was staring. The office manager appeared from behind the desk. "Dr. Harrison, can I see you in my office?" My husband stepped between us before Dr. Harrison could say another word. His jaw was set in a way I'd only seen twice in our marriage, both times when someone had really crossed a line. Every patient in the waiting room stopped moving. The receptionist froze with her hand on the phone. Even the fish tank in the corner seemed to go quiet. My husband's voice came out low and controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it. Dr. Harrison actually took a step back. The office manager was already moving toward us from behind the desk with her hands raised like she was trying to calm down a dangerous situation. My husband didn't yell, but somehow that made it worse. He told Dr. Harrison exactly what he thought of him in words I won't repeat here, then grabbed my hand and started walking toward the exit. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my purse. Dr. Harrison called after us that we were being dramatic and that he was only trying to help. My husband stopped walking. He turned around so fast that Dr. Harrison actually flinched. The look on my husband's face could have melted steel or frozen hell or whatever metaphor works because it was terrifying and I wasn't even the target. We left without saying anything else because there was nothing else to say. In the parking lot, I made it 3 steps toward our car before I started crying. Not quiet tears either, but full-body sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. My husband wrapped his arms around me right there between 2 minivans and let me fall apart. He kept saying he was sorry over and over. Sorry for not knowing what was happening during the exam. Sorry for reading that stupid fitness magazine in the waiting room, which apparently Dr. Harrison had used against me. Sorry for not protecting me from something he couldn't have possibly known about. I told him it wasn't his fault through the crying, but I don't think he believed me. A woman walking to her car saw us and quickly looked away. I didn't care. Let everyone see. Let them all know what that doctor did. My husband said we were going to report this and make sure Dr. Harrison never did it to anyone else. I nodded against his chest because I couldn't speak yet. We stood there for probably 10 minutes while I cried, and he held me and the sun beat down on the parking lot asphalt. That evening, my husband set up his laptop at the kitchen table while I sat on the couch trying to process what had happened. He found the state medical board website and started reading through complaint procedures out loud. Patient rights violations, professional misconduct, sexual harassment in medical settings. Each category seemed to fit what Dr. Harrison had done. He grabbed a notebook and started making a list of everything Dr. Harrison had said. Every comment about my weight, every mention of my husband, the salon business card, the before and after photos, the statistics about divorce rates, the comment about grooming. Writing it all down made it feel more real and somehow worse. I had to correct him twice because he got the order wrong. My brain had apparently recorded every horrible word in perfect detail. We worked on the list for over an hour until we had 3 pages of notes with timestamps and exact quotes as close as I could remember them. My husband kept clenching his jaw while he wrote. When we finished, he closed the notebook and said we had enough to bury that guy. The next morning, I called the medical practice before I could talk myself out of it. The receptionist answered in her cheerful voice, and I asked for my complete medical records. Her tone changed immediately. She put me on hold for almost 5 minutes. When she came back, she said the office manager wanted to speak with me. I was transferred to another line where a woman's voice asked if I could come in to discuss my concerns in person. I said no. I wanted to file a formal complaint right now over the phone about Dr. Harrison's conduct during yesterday's exam. There was a long pause. She asked me to hold again. This time I waited for 7 minutes. Finally, she came back and said she was documenting my complaint and would forward it to the practice owners. She asked me to come in to discuss the incident. I told her I'd come in, but only with my husband and only to pick up my records. She agreed, and we set up a time for 2 days later. When I hung up, my hands were shaking again, but this time it was anger, not fear. 2 days later, my husband took the afternoon off work, and we drove back to that office. I made him park in a different spot because I couldn't look at the place where I'd broken down crying. The office manager met us in a conference room instead of the waiting area. She was probably 50 with gray hair pulled back tight and a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had a folder in front of her with my name on it. She thanked us for coming in and said she took my complaint very seriously. My husband asked if Dr. Harrison was still seeing patients. She said he was currently on administrative leave pending an internal review. That surprised me. I'd expected them to defend him or brush it off. She pulled out a form and asked me to describe what happened. I went through the whole thing again while she took notes. She didn't react to any of it, which made me wonder how many times she'd heard similar stories. When I finished, she said she was documenting everything and forwarding it to the practice owners and their legal team. My husband asked how many other complaints they'd received about Dr. Harrison. She paused too long before saying she couldn't discuss other patients. That pause told me everything. There had been others. The office manager slid a piece of paper across the table. She said the nurse Catherine had also submitted a statement about what she witnessed during my exam. Reading those words made something loosen in my chest. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. A medical professional who was in the room agreed that what happened was wrong. The office manager said Catherine's statement corroborated my account and would be included in the internal review. She also said Catherine had mentioned trying to intervene during the exam and again in the hallway afterward. My husband asked what would happen next. The office manager said the practice owners would complete their review and make a decision about Dr. Harrison's employment. She recommended I also file a complaint with the state medical board since they handled licensing issues. She actually recommended it herself, which seemed significant. We left with my medical records in a manila envelope and slightly more hope that something might actually happen. That same week, I filed the formal complaint with the state medical board. The online form was incredibly long and detailed. It asked for dates, times, specific statements, witnesses, and supporting documentation. I had to describe exactly what Dr. Ed Harrison said and did, including the most humiliating parts. There was a section for uploading documents, so I scanned my medical records and the timeline my husband and I had created. The form took almost 2 hours to complete because I kept having to stop and compose myself. My husband sat next to me the whole time, even though he had work emails piling up. When I finally hit submit, he squeezed my hand. The confirmation screen said my complaint had been received and assigned a case number. It said someone from the medical board would contact me within 2 weeks to discuss next steps. I wrote down the case number in 3 different places because I was terrified of losing it. 3 days later, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer because I hate spam calls, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said she was Janelle Melton, an investigator with the state medical board assigned to my case. She wanted to schedule an interview to get my full statement and explain the investigation process. We set up a time for the following week at a medical board office downtown. She said the interview would take approximately 2 hours, and I could bring someone with me for support. She also said this type of investigation typically took several months because they had to interview witnesses, review records, and build a complete case. Several months sounded like forever, but at least something was happening. After we hung up, I felt lighter somehow. Someone official was taking this seriously. Someone whose job was to hold doctors accountable was actually investigating. The interview with Janelle took place in a small windowless office that smelled like coffee and cleaning products. Janelle was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair and a kind face. She had a recording device on the desk and a thick folder with my case number on it. My husband sat in a chair against the wall while Janelle asked me questions. She wanted me to start from the beginning and describe everything that happened in exact detail. So I did. I told her about the stirrups and the paper gown and feeling vulnerable. I repeated every comment Dr. Harrison made about my weight and my husband and my marriage. I described the salon business card and the before and after photos and the statistics. I explained how he followed me into the waiting room and spoke to my husband directly. Janelle took notes the entire time and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said his behavior clearly violated multiple medical ethics standards, including professional boundaries, patient dignity, and appropriate conduct during intimate examinations. She said my complaint was being taken very seriously, and they already had Catherine's witness statement and the office manager's documentation. She couldn't tell me about other complaints due to confidentiality, but her tone suggested there were others. The interview lasted almost 3 hours instead of 2 because Janelle was so thorough. When we finally left, I felt exhausted but validated. This was real. This was actually happening. A week later, Janelle called again and asked if I could come back to her office for a follow-up meeting. She said she had some additional information about the investigation that she wanted to share with me in person. My stomach dropped because I didn't know if that meant good news or bad news. When I arrived at the medical board office, Janelle looked more serious than she had during the first interview. She closed the door and sat down across from me with a thick folder on her desk. She explained that during their investigation, they had discovered 2 other formal complaints filed against Dr. Harrison in the past year. Both complaints involved inappropriate comments about patients' bodies during exams. One woman said he told her she looked like she'd given up on herself and her husband probably noticed. Another woman said he spent 10 minutes during her exam talking about how obesity was destroying her marriage prospects. Both complaints had been filed with the medical board, but the investigations had stalled because the patients didn't want to pursue them further after the initial report. Hearing this made me feel sick and angry at the same time. Dr. Harrison had done this to other women and nobody stopped him. He just kept practicing and kept humiliating patients, and the system let him continue. Janelle said my complaint was different because I was willing to see it through, and because Catherine's witness statement provided corroboration that the medical board rarely got in these cases. She said they were taking my case very seriously and building a strong file for potential disciplinary action. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those other women and how scared they must have been to just drop their complaints. I understood why they did it because going through this process was exhausting and scary, but I also felt determined not to let Dr. Harrison get away with this pattern of abuse. My husband found me at 2 in the morning sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and asked what I was thinking about. I told him about the other complaints and how angry I was that the medical board knew about Dr. Harrison's behavior, but he was still seeing patients. My husband was quiet for a minute, and then he said maybe I should talk to a lawyer. He said the medical board complaint was important, but maybe there were other legal options I should know about. He said he wanted me to have every possible tool to hold Dr. Harrison accountable. The next morning, my husband started researching attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice and patient rights cases. He made a list of 5 lawyers and started calling their offices to ask about free consultations. Most of them were booked out for weeks, but one office said they had an opening the following afternoon. The lawyer's name was Gabriella Paget, and her assistant said she had extensive experience with medical misconduct cases. My husband scheduled the appointment and took another day off work to come with me. Gabriella's office was in a building downtown that looked professional but not fancy. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and medical law journals on the coffee table. When Gabriella came out to meet us, she was maybe 50 with gray hair and a firm handshake. She led us into her office and asked me to tell her everything that happened from the beginning. So I went through the whole story again. The exam table and the stirrups and every comment Dr. Harrison made, the waiting room confrontation and the office manager's reaction, the medical board complaint, and Janelle's investigation. Gabriella took notes the entire time and asked specific questions about timing and exact words. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and explained that I had grounds for both a civil lawsuit against Dr. Harrison and the medical practice, and for supporting the medical board's disciplinary process. She said Dr. Harrison's conduct violated my patient rights and constituted medical misconduct. She said the practice might also be liable if they knew about his behavior and didn't stop it. Then she explained that she worked on contingency, which meant I wouldn't pay anything unless we won the case. She would take a percentage of any settlement or judgment, but I wouldn't have to pay upfront legal fees. This was huge because I had been worried about how much hiring a lawyer would cost. Gabriella said she wanted to take my case and that she thought we had a strong claim based on what I'd described. She said her investigator could start gathering evidence right away if I decided to hire her. I looked at my husband and he nodded. I told Gabriella I wanted to hire her and move forward with building a case against Dr. Harrison. She pulled out a contract and explained all the terms clearly. I signed it and felt like I was taking real action instead of just waiting for the medical board to do something. Gabriella said her investigator, Lucas Paget, would contact me within a few days to start gathering evidence. She explained that Lucas would request records from the medical practice and interview potential witnesses, including Catherine if she was willing. Gabriella said having a nurse witness was extremely valuable because medical professionals rarely spoke up against doctors they worked with. She asked if I had any way to contact Catherine directly, and I said no, but I could probably get her information through the medical practice. Gabriella said Lucas would handle that and would be very respectful of Catherine's position. 3 days later, Lucas called me and introduced himself. He had a calm voice and explained that he'd been working with Gabriella for 15 years on medical malpractice cases. He said he wanted to start by requesting my complete medical records from Dr. Harrison's practice, including any notes from the exam where the incident happened. He also wanted to request their policies on patient complaints and professional conduct. Lucas said he would send formal record requests that day, and they had 30 days to respond. He also asked if I felt comfortable reaching out to Catherine to see if she would be willing to give a formal statement to my attorney. I said I would try, but I didn't know if she would talk to me. I spent 2 days working up the courage to call the medical practice and ask for Catherine. When I finally did, the receptionist said Catherine was with a patient, but she could take a message. I left my number and said it was important. Catherine called me back that evening after she got off work. Her voice was cautious when she said my name. I told her I had hired an attorney, and that my lawyer wanted to know if she would be willing to give a formal statement about what happened during my exam with Dr. Harrison. There was a long silence, and then Catherine said she wanted to help, but she was scared of losing her job. I told her my lawyer had mentioned something about whistleblower protections for medical staff who report misconduct. Catherine said she would think about it and asked for my lawyer's contact information. I gave her Gabriella's number and thanked her for even considering it. 2 days later, Gabriella called me sounding excited. She said Catherine had contacted her and agreed to give a formal statement after Gabriella explained the legal protections available to her. Catherine was meeting with Lucas the next week to provide a detailed account of Dr. Harrison's behavior during my exam and her attempts to intervene. Gabriella said Catherine's statement would strengthen my case significantly because she could describe the medical setting and Dr. Harrison's violation of professional standards from a clinical perspective. Having a nurse willing to testify against a doctor was rare and powerful. Lucas worked fast. Within 2 weeks, he had gathered my medical records and started interviewing people. He called me one afternoon with information that made my blood boil. He said he'd been investigating the medical practice's history and discovered that their insurance company had paid out 2 previous settlements involving Dr. Harrison's inappropriate conduct with patients. The practice had kept him on staff despite knowing about his pattern of behavior. Lucas said this added institutional liability to my case because the practice had been on notice that Dr. Harrison was a problem, and they did nothing to protect patients. He was still gathering details about those previous settlements, but the fact that they existed meant the practice couldn't claim my complaint was isolated or unexpected. They knew Dr. Harrison behaved inappropriately with patients, and they let him continue practicing anyway. Gabriella said this information changed the strategy for my case because now we could argue the practice was negligent in their oversight and created an unsafe environment for patients. She said the insurance company would probably want to settle once they realized how much evidence we had of the practice's knowledge and inaction. But dealing with all the legal stuff was taking a toll on me mentally. I was having trouble sleeping and kept replaying the exam in my head. I felt anxious all the time and started avoiding situations that made me feel vulnerable. My husband noticed I was struggling and suggested I talk to someone professional about what I was going through. He found a therapist named Aaliyah Carson who specialized in medical trauma. I was hesitant at first because I'd never been to therapy before, but I agreed to try one session. Aaliyah's office was in a quiet building with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. She had a gentle way of talking that made me feel safe. During our first session, I told her about the exam and Dr. Harrison's comments and how violated I felt. Aaliyah listened without interrupting, and then explained that what I was experiencing was a normal response to a serious abuse of power. She said medical settings require patients to be physically vulnerable and trust their doctors to maintain professional boundaries. When a doctor violates that trust, it creates a specific type of trauma because the person who was supposed to protect you became the person who hurt you. Hearing her explain it that way made me feel less crazy for being so upset. She said we would work together on processing the experience and managing the anxiety it created. Over the next few weeks, I saw Aaliyah every Tuesday afternoon. During one session, I realized I'd been avoiding all medical appointments since the incident with Dr. Harrison. I had canceled a dentist cleaning because just the thought of being in a medical chair made my heart race. I'd skipped my annual physical with my regular doctor. I'd even avoided going to urgent care when I had a bad cold because I couldn't handle the idea of being examined. Aaliyah helped me understand that this avoidance was my brain trying to protect me from feeling vulnerable again. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques to manage the panic I felt in medical settings. She said we would work on gradually exposing me to medical appointments again, but at my own pace. Just knowing I wasn't alone in feeling this way, and having tools to cope with it, made a huge difference. I started sleeping better and feeling less on edge all the time. Meanwhile, Gabriella was moving forward with the legal case. She called me one morning in early November and said she was sending a formal demand letter to Dr. Harrison, the medical practice, and their insurance company. The letter would outline my case, including detailed descriptions of Dr. Harrison's conduct, Catherine's witness statement, and the practice's negligence in keeping him on staff despite previous complaints. The letter would request a settlement to resolve the matter without going to trial. Gabriella said this was standard procedure and would give us a sense of whether they wanted to settle or fight. She said the insurance company would probably respond within 2 weeks. I asked what would happen if they refused to settle, and she said we would file a lawsuit and take it to court. She said she was confident in our case either way, but settling would be faster and less stressful for me. I told her to send the letter and we would see what happened. Waiting for their response felt like forever. I checked my email constantly and jumped every time my phone rang. Gabriella had said they had 15 business days to respond, but I was hoping they would answer sooner. The response came exactly 14 days after Gabriella sent the demand letter. She called me and said the medical practice's attorney had sent back a settlement offer. I could hear in her voice that she wasn't impressed. She said they were offering a small amount of money and requiring me to sign a confidentiality agreement that would prevent me from discussing the case publicly or with other potential victims. Gabriella said the offer was insultingly low, and the confidentiality clause was designed to protect Dr. Harrison more than compensate me. She advised me strongly not to accept because agreeing to stay silent would let Dr. Harrison continue harming other patients without consequences. She said we should counter with a much higher settlement amount and refuse any confidentiality requirements. I agreed immediately because the whole point of doing this was to hold Dr. Harrison accountable and protect other women from going through what I did. Taking money to stay quiet would defeat that purpose completely. I called Gabriella that evening and told her we needed to reject the offer. She sounded pleased when I explained that accepting money to stay silent would let Harrison keep hurting other women. My husband sat next to me on the couch nodding while I talked, and when I hung up, he squeezed my hand and said we were doing the right thing, even if it meant more stress. Gabriella sent the rejection letter the next morning with a counteroffer that included much higher compensation and absolutely no confidentiality requirements. She said the practice's insurance company would probably push back hard because they wanted this buried, but we were prepared for that fight now. 2 days later, Janelle called with news that made my stomach flip. 3 more patients had filed complaints about Harrison after hearing about my case through the medical board's internal network. She said the investigation had expanded significantly, and Harrison was now facing potential license suspension, instead of just a reprimand. The medical board was treating this as a pattern of misconduct, rather than isolated incidents, which meant much more serious consequences. Janelle walked me through what would happen next, including a formal hearing where Harrison would have to answer to all the complaints together. She said the timeline was probably 3 to 4 months before the hearing date got scheduled, but the investigation was moving faster than usual because of the number of victims coming forward. Lucas called me a week after that and asked if I could meet him at Gabriella's office to discuss something important he'd found. I drove there the next afternoon and found both of them waiting in the conference room with files spread across the table. Lucas explained that he'd tracked down 2 of Harrison's former patients who had filed complaints years ago and accepted confidential settlements. Both women had signed agreements preventing them from discussing their experiences publicly, but they were willing to talk to us privately to help build the case. Lucas had recorded their statements with their permission, and he played the audio for me while Gabriella took notes. The first woman described an exam almost identical to mine, where Harrison told her that her boyfriend would leave her if she didn't lose weight and get cosmetic procedures. The second woman said Harrison had shown her before and after photos of other patients, and suggested her husband was probably cheating because of her appearance. Both women were in tears during parts of their statements, and both said they'd accepted the settlements because they felt powerless and wanted the whole thing to be over. Hearing their stories made me realize how calculated Harrison's behavior was, how he knew exactly what to say to make vulnerable women feel worthless. Lucas said he was still trying to find other former patients who might have settled quietly, and Gabriella said these statements would be crucial for proving Harrison had a long history of this conduct. The pattern became obvious once we laid out all the complaints chronologically. Harrison specifically targeted women he perceived as overweight or not meeting his standards of attractiveness. His comments were always framed as medical concern or marriage advice, which gave him cover to claim he was just being a caring doctor with poor bedside manner. But the consistency across different patients over 8 years showed this wasn't accidental or well-intentioned. It was systematic harassment disguised as medical advice, and the practice had enabled it by settling complaints quietly, instead of disciplining him or reporting him to the medical board. Gabriella said this pattern would be the foundation of our lawsuit, because it proved the practice knew Harrison was dangerous and kept him on staff anyway. Gabriella filed the formal lawsuit 3 weeks later against both Harrison and the medical practice. The complaint argued that the practice was liable for knowingly retaining a doctor with a documented history of patient abuse. She sent me a copy of the filing, and I read through the legal language describing everything Harrison had done to me and the other women. Seeing it written out in official court documents made it feel more real somehow, like validation that this wasn't just in my head or me being too sensitive. The local news picked up the story 2 days after the filing, though they didn't use my name or any identifying details. The headline was about a gynecologist facing multiple complaints for inappropriate conduct during exams, and the article mentioned the lawsuit without going into graphic details. After the news story ran, Gabriella's phone started ringing constantly. 4 more women contacted her office within the first week, all describing similar experiences with Harrison. One woman said he'd told her during a prenatal exam that pregnancy weight was ruining her body, and her husband would resent her for it. Another said Harrison had commented on her grooming and suggested she visit his wife's salon for maintenance. The scope of Harrison's misconduct was far larger than anyone had realized. Gabriella said we were now looking at potentially 8 to 10 victims spanning at least 8 years of practice, and she was considering whether to convert this into a class action lawsuit to hold the practice accountable for the full extent of the harm they'd allowed. The medical practice finally suspended Harrison without pay 5 days after the 4th woman came forward. Their attorney called Gabriella requesting a settlement meeting to discuss more serious terms. Gabriella told me this was the first sign they were actually scared, because before this they'd been treating the whole thing like a nuisance they could pay to make go away. Now they were facing a public scandal with multiple victims and a doctor whose license was about to get suspended. She said we had significant leverage now and could push for real institutional changes as part of any settlement, not just money. I had my regular therapy session with Aaliyah the day after Harrison got suspended, and something shifted during our conversation. I was able to articulate clearly that Harrison's comments weren't about my health or my marriage at all. They were about exerting power over me when I was at my most vulnerable, using his position as a doctor to make me feel worthless and afraid. Understanding this helped me separate his abuse from my actual self-worth, because his words had nothing to do with reality, and everything to do with his need to control and demean women. Aaliyah said this was a major breakthrough in my healing process, recognizing that the problem was his abuse of power, rather than anything wrong with me. My husband and I started having longer conversations about how the whole incident had affected our relationship. He admitted one night while we were making dinner that he'd been struggling with anger and guilt since the waiting room confrontation. He felt helpless watching Harrison follow me out and say those things, and he kept replaying the moment, wondering if he should have done something different. I told him he'd handled it perfectly by getting me out of there and supporting my decisions about how to respond, but he said the feeling of powerlessness was eating at him. I suggested he talk to someone too, maybe find a therapist who could help him process the anger and guilt he was carrying. He agreed to look into it, and I felt relieved that he was willing to get support instead of just trying to tough it out. Janelle called in early December to tell me the medical board had scheduled Harrison's formal hearing for late January. She said I would need to testify about what happened during my exam, along with the other patients who had filed complaints. The thought of testifying made my chest tight and my hands shake, but I knew it was necessary if we wanted Harrison to actually lose his license, instead of just getting a slap on the wrist. Janelle walked me through what the hearing would be like and what kinds of questions I should expect, and she promised the board members took these cases seriously and would treat me with respect. I hung up feeling scared but determined, because this was my chance to make sure Harrison never did this to another woman again. Gabriella spent 3 hours with me the week before the hearing, sitting across from me at her conference table with a yellow legal pad full of questions. She asked me to describe the exam room, what I was wearing, where Harrison stood, exactly what he said word for word. I stumbled over some details at first because reliving it made my throat tight, but she kept redirecting me back to facts instead of feelings. She told me the medical board would ask similar questions, and I needed to stay calm and specific, not let my emotions make me sound unreliable. We practiced my answers until I could recite the timeline without crying or getting angry, just stating what happened like I was reading from a report. Gabriella reminded me that I'd given the same account to the office manager, to Janelle, to Lucas, and now to her, and that consistency made me credible no matter what Harrison's attorney tried to claim. She said my detailed memory of his exact words, down to the desperate housewife discount comment, showed I wasn't exaggerating or making things up. By the end of our practice session, I felt more prepared than scared, like I had armor made of facts that Harrison couldn't break through. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom, with a long table where 5 medical board members sat with folders and laptops. Harrison sat at a table on the left side with his attorney, a man in an expensive suit who kept whispering to him. I sat at a table on the right with Gabriella, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The board chair, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, asked me to state my name and describe what happened during my appointment. I looked straight at her instead of at Harrison and told her everything, starting with being in the stirrups when he made the comment about my husband deserving better. Harrison shifted in his chair and wrote something on a notepad, his expression annoyed like this was wasting his time. His attorney objected twice, saying I was characterizing Harrison's intent instead of just reporting facts, but the board chair overruled him both times. Seeing Harrison look irritated instead of sorry actually made it easier to keep talking, because it proved he still didn't think he'd done anything wrong. I described every comment he made, the business card for his wife's salon, how he followed me into the waiting room, what he said to my husband. The board members took notes and asked clarifying questions about whether Catherine was present the whole time and whether I'd asked him to stop. When I finished, the chair thanked me and said Catherine would testify next. Catherine walked in wearing scrubs from her new job and sat in the chair I'd just left. She looked directly at the board members when she spoke, her voice steady and professional. She confirmed she was in the exam room the entire time and heard everything Harrison said to me. She described how she tried to redirect him by mentioning other patients, how she suggested we continue the exam, but he ignored her completely. Then she said this wasn't the first time she'd witnessed him making inappropriate comments to patients about their weight or appearance, that she'd reported concerns to the office manager twice before, but nothing changed. Harrison's attorney jumped up and objected, saying Catherine's other observations weren't relevant to my specific complaint, but the board chair said they were absolutely relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior and told Catherine to continue. Catherine described 2 other incidents in detail, including one where Harrison told a patient her stretch marks were disgusting and her husband probably couldn't look at her naked anymore. The board members exchanged glances and wrote more notes. Catherine's testimony as a medical professional carried weight that mine alone couldn't, because she had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking up against a doctor she'd worked with. After Catherine finished, 3 other women testified one by one about their experiences with Harrison. The first woman, who looked about my age, described how Harrison commented on her pubic hair during a routine exam and suggested her boyfriend would prefer her waxed. The second woman, older with gray streaks in her hair, said Harrison told her that women her age shouldn't let themselves get flabby, because it made them unattractive to their husbands. The third woman, younger and visibly nervous, explained that Harrison had made comments about her breast size and asked if she'd considered implants to keep her partner interested. Each story followed the same pattern, Harrison using his position as a doctor to make degrading comments disguised as medical concern or relationship advice. The board members looked more disturbed with each testimony, the woman chair pressing her lips together in a thin line and the man on the end shaking his head slightly. Harrison kept writing notes and whispering to his attorney, but his face was getting red and his jaw was clenched. By the time the third patient finished, the room felt heavy with the weight of all these violations stacked together, proof that this wasn't about my sensitivity or misunderstanding, but about Harrison's systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. Harrison's attorney stood up for his turn and argued that his client's comments were legitimate medical observations delivered with unfortunate word choices. He said doctors had a duty to discuss weight, hygiene, and lifestyle factors that affected health, and that some patients were overly sensitive to necessary medical advice. He pulled up studies on his laptop about obesity and relationship satisfaction, trying to prove Harrison was citing real research. But when Harrison himself took the stand to testify, everything his attorney built up collapsed. The board chair asked Harrison if he understood why his comments might have been inappropriate, and he said patients needed to hear hard truths even if it hurt their feelings. She asked if he thought it was professional to comment on a patient's aesthetic appearance during an exam, and he said he was trying to motivate me to take better care of myself for my marriage. His tone was defensive and dismissive, like the board members were overreacting just like I had. One of the male board members asked Harrison directly if he thought telling a patient her husband deserved better was appropriate medical advice, and Harrison actually said yes, that sometimes shock tactics were necessary to get through to people in denial about their health. His attorney tried to interrupt and redirect, but Harrison kept talking, saying he'd helped dozens of patients improve their lives by being honest about their physical shortcomings. Every answer made him look worse, proving he genuinely believed he had the right to judge and shame patients under the guise of medical care. The board members left to deliberate, and we sat in the hallway for 2 hours. Harrison and his attorney stayed in the hearing room. I texted my husband updates, and Gabriella made phone calls while Catherine sat with me on the bench, both of us not saying much. When the board members called us back in, the chair read from a prepared statement. She said the board found clear and convincing evidence that Harrison had violated professional ethics standards by making inappropriate personal comments to multiple patients during medical exams. She said his behavior constituted a pattern of harassment that created a hostile and demeaning environment for patients seeking necessary medical care. Then she announced their decision to suspend Harrison's medical license for a minimum of 2 years, with reinstatement only possible after completing ethics training and working under supervision for an additional year. It wasn't permanent, but it was significant. taking him out of practice for years and putting conditions on his return. Harrison's face went from red to pale, and his attorney started talking about appeals. The chair continued that the board was also referring the case to the state attorney general for potential criminal investigation of patient abuse. I felt Gabriella squeeze my hand under the table. Outside the hearing room, 2 of the other patients who testified approached me and Gabriella. The younger woman asked if she could join my civil lawsuit against the practice because she wanted them held accountable too. The older woman said the same thing, that the license suspension was good, but the practice needed to pay for enabling Harrison all these years. Gabriella explained that we could pursue a class action approach where all the victims sued together, which would be stronger than individual cases, and force the practice to take institutional responsibility. She said class actions also meant we could demand broader policy changes that would protect future patients, not just get individual compensation. Both women said they were interested, and Gabriella took their contact information. Standing in that hallway with other women who'd been through the same abuse, I felt less alone than I had since the whole thing started. We weren't just individual victims anymore, but a group demanding change. 2 weeks after the hearing, Gabriella called to say the medical practice's insurance company had made a serious settlement offer. She came to my house with a folder full of documents and sat at my kitchen table explaining the terms. The offer included financial compensation for each plaintiff based on the severity of our cases, plus a collective fund to cover therapy costs for anyone who needed it. More importantly, the practice agreed to implement new patient safety protocols, including mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams, a confidential feedback system for patients to report concerns, and annual ethics training for all staff. They also agreed to publish these policies publicly on their website and in the waiting room. Gabriella said the insurance company wanted to settle now to avoid a trial that would expose more details about how long they'd known about Harrison's behavior and done nothing. The compensation amounts were substantial, enough to cover my therapy costs with Aaliyah for years plus money left over. But accepting the settlement meant no trial, no public courtroom testimony that newspapers could report on. Gabriella spread the settlement documents across my table and walked me and the other plaintiffs through every detail during a conference call. She explained this was a strong offer that accomplished most of what we wanted, real money and real policy changes that could prevent future patients from experiencing what we did. But she also said the decision was completely ours to make, that she would support whatever we chose. The other women on the call asked questions about whether the settlement would be public record and whether we could still talk about our experiences afterward. Gabriella confirmed the settlement itself would be public, but our individual compensation amounts would stay confidential, and there was no gag order preventing us from sharing our stories. One woman said she wanted the practice to admit wrongdoing publicly, not just agree to policy changes. Gabriella explained the settlement included a formal apology acknowledging their failure to protect patients and their commitment to doing better. We agreed to think about it for a few days before deciding as a group. I talked it over with my husband that night while we made dinner, chopping vegetables and discussing whether the settlement felt like enough justice. He said Harrison losing his license was huge, that the suspension meant he couldn't hurt anyone else for years. I agreed, but part of me still wanted a trial where everything would come out publicly, where a judge would validate how wrong his behavior was. My husband pointed out that we'd already achieved significant consequences, that Harrison was suspended and the practice was implementing real reforms. At my next therapy session, I asked Aaliyah what she thought about the settlement. She reminded me that closure doesn't always come from external validation, but from internal peace, and asked whether accepting the settlement or going to trial would help me heal better. I realized that dragging this out for months or years of trial preparation would keep me stuck in victim mode, while accepting the settlement and moving forward would let me reclaim my life. The license suspension and mandatory reforms felt like meaningful change that would outlast my individual case. I called each of the other women individually over the next 2 days to talk through the settlement offer. Most of them sounded relieved to finally have an end in sight. One woman named Sarah said she couldn't face a trial where she'd have to testify publicly about what happened to her. Another woman said the money would help her pay for the therapy she needed to process everything. We scheduled a conference call with Gabriella for the following afternoon to make our final decision as a group. During that call, we went around and each woman shared her thoughts. Everyone agreed that the compensation was fair and that the policy changes felt meaningful. Nobody wanted to keep fighting just to fight. Gabriella reminded us that we'd already accomplished something huge with the license suspension and that the settlement would create lasting protections for future patients. We took a vote and it was unanimous. All of us agreed to accept the settlement terms. Gabriella said she'd notify the medical practice's attorneys and start the paperwork process. The whole thing would be finalized within a few weeks. The settlement documents arrived at Gabriella's office about 10 days later. She walked me through every page during an appointment, explaining what each section meant. The compensation amounts were based on a formula that considered how severe each woman's experience had been and how much it had affected her life. My amount was substantial because of how aggressive and prolonged the harassment was during my exam. There was also a collective fund specifically for therapy costs that any of us could access for up to 5 years. The policy changes section was detailed and specific. The medical practice had to implement mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams starting immediately. They had to create a patient feedback system where people could report concerns anonymously. They had to establish a zero-tolerance policy for any inappropriate conduct by medical staff. Most importantly, they had to conduct annual training on professional boundaries and patient dignity, with an independent medical ethics consultant overseeing the program. Gabriella pointed out that these changes would protect patients long after our individual cases were resolved. The practice also had to publish their new patient safety policies on their website and in their waiting rooms. Everything would be public and transparent. I signed the settlement agreement right there in her office. My hand shook a little while I wrote my name, but I felt good about the decision. The settlement payment came through about 3 weeks later. I opened the envelope from the medical practice's insurance company and found a check along with a formal letter from the practice owners. The letter acknowledged their failure to protect patients from inappropriate conduct. It said they took full responsibility for not addressing concerns about certain staff members sooner. It committed them to creating a culture where patient dignity and safety came first. The apology felt genuine, not like legal language written by attorneys trying to avoid liability. I read it twice and then showed it to my husband. He said it sounded like they actually understood what they'd done wrong. The money was enough to cover several years of therapy with Aaliyah, plus pay off some medical bills we'd been carrying. I deposited the check and scheduled my next therapy appointment for the following week. With the legal case finally resolved, I focused more on my own healing. Aaliyah and I worked through the anxiety I still felt about medical appointments. She gave me tools for managing panic when I had to see doctors. We practiced what I would say if any medical professional ever made me uncomfortable again. I learned that I could leave an appointment at any time, that I could request a different provider, that I had rights even in vulnerable medical situations. After a few months of this work, I felt ready to schedule a physical with a new doctor. My old primary care physician had retired the year before, so I needed to establish care with someone new anyway. I asked friends for recommendations, and several people suggested a doctor named Jennifer Huang. She was about my age, had great reviews online, and specialized in women's health. I called her office and scheduled an appointment for the following month. The receptionist was friendly and asked if I had any specific concerns or accommodations I needed. I appreciated being asked. The appointment with Jennifer Huang was everything my experience with Harrison wasn't. She introduced herself and shook my hand before starting the exam. She explained each step of the physical before doing it and asked permission to proceed. She focused entirely on my health, asking about my medical history and any symptoms I'd been experiencing. When she did the physical exam portions, she was professional and efficient. She never commented on my appearance except to note clinical observations relevant to my health. She asked about my stress levels and sleep patterns because those things affected overall wellness. She recommended some routine blood work to check my vitamin levels and thyroid function. The whole appointment felt respectful and safe. I left her office feeling like I'd been treated as a person, not judged or evaluated. The positive experience helped me rebuild trust that not all medical professionals would abuse their power. I scheduled my next annual exam before leaving and actually felt okay about it. A few weeks after my appointment with Jennifer Huang, I got a text message from Catherine. She said she needed to talk to me about something important. We met for coffee at a place halfway between our homes. Catherine looked different from she had at the medical practice, more relaxed and less stressed. She told me she was leaving the practice where Harrison had worked. She'd accepted a position at a women's health clinic that had better ethical standards and actually valued their staff. She thanked me for coming forward about what happened because it gave her the courage to demand a better work environment. She said watching me fight back made her realize she didn't have to stay in a place that tolerated inappropriate behavior. Her new clinic had strict protocols for patient safety, and staff were encouraged to speak up if they saw problems. She felt good about going to work there. I told her I was proud of her for making the change and that she'd been brave to speak up as a witness in my case. We talked for over an hour about how the whole situation had affected both of us. She admitted she'd lost sleep over not intervening more forcefully during my exam. I reminded her that she did intervene and that her testimony had been crucial. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. About a month after the settlement was finalized, I got an email from a patient advocacy organization I'd never heard of. They'd learned about my case through the public settlement documents and wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking at one of their meetings. The group helped people navigate medical complaints and taught them how to stand up for themselves in healthcare settings. They met monthly and brought in speakers who'd successfully advocated for themselves or others. I thought about it for a few days before responding. The idea of sharing my experience publicly felt scary, but also potentially meaningful. I talked it over with Aaliyah during our next session. She pointed out that I'd moved from being a victim to being a survivor, to potentially being an advocate for others. I decided to say yes. The speaking engagement was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving me time to prepare. I worked with Aaliyah on what I wanted to say and how to tell my story in a way that would help others without re-traumatizing myself. The organization sent me an outline of topics they hoped I'd cover, including how to file complaints, what to expect during investigations, and how to protect yourself emotionally through the process. My husband suggested we take a weekend trip to celebrate the case being resolved. We hadn't had any real relaxation since the incident 4 months earlier. He booked a cabin in the mountains about 2 hours away. We left on a Friday afternoon and spent the weekend hiking, reading, and just being together without the stress of legal proceedings hanging over us. On Saturday night, we sat on the cabin's deck watching the sunset. My husband told me he was proud of how I'd fought back against what happened. He said watching me advocate for myself made him love me even more. He admitted he'd felt helpless during a lot of the process, wanting to fix things but knowing this was my battle to fight. I told him his support had meant everything, that knowing he believed me and stood by me gave me the strength to keep going. We talked about how the whole experience had changed us as individuals and as a couple. We both agreed we communicated better now, that going through something difficult together had strengthened our relationship. The weekend felt like a reset, a chance to remember who we were beyond the trauma and legal battles. 2 weeks after our trip, I got a phone call from Janelle at the medical board. She had news about Harrison. He'd decided not to pursue reinstatement after his suspension period ended. Essentially, he was giving up his medical license rather than going through the process of proving he'd changed and deserved to practice again. His medical career was over. Janelle also told me that 2 other doctors at his former practice had left following internal investigations. The practice had looked into their conduct after the settlement and found concerning patterns with both of them. They'd resigned before facing formal discipline. The whole culture at that practice was dismantled and rebuilt. Janelle said my complaint had triggered a much larger examination of how that office operated. She thanked me for coming forward and said cases like mine helped protect future patients even beyond the individual situation. I felt a sense of closure hearing that Harrison wouldn't be treating patients anymore. The thought of him continuing to practice had bothered me even after the settlement. The medical practice published their new patient safety protocols on their website about a month after the settlement was finalized. They sent out a public statement to local media outlets announcing the changes. The statement acknowledged past failures in protecting patients and outlined their commitment to doing better. The new protocols included mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams, no exceptions. They created a patient feedback system where people could report concerns either directly or anonymously through a third-party service. They established a zero-tolerance policy for any inappropriate conduct by medical staff, with immediate suspension pending investigation for any complaints. They committed to annual training on professional boundaries and patient dignity, overseen by an independent medical ethics consultant who would report directly to the practice owners. The statement included contact information for the ethics consultant, so patients could reach out directly if needed. Reading the public statement felt validating. These weren't just private promises made in a settlement agreement. They were public commitments that the practice would be held accountable for keeping. About 3 weeks after the settlement closed, Gabriella forwarded me an email from a woman named Sarah, who'd seen the news coverage about my case. She wrote that she'd been a patient of Harrison's 4 years ago, and he'd made comments about her body during her postpartum exam that made her feel terrible about herself. She'd switched doctors but never reported him because she thought maybe she was being too sensitive. Reading about my case helped her understand that what happened to her wasn't okay. She thanked me for speaking up and said knowing other women experienced the same thing validated feelings she'd been carrying for years. Gabriella sent me 2 more emails like that over the next few days. One woman said Harrison told her during a routine exam that her husband probably wasn't attracted to her anymore because of stretch marks. Another said he'd commented on her grooming choices in a way that made her feel disgusting. Both women had switched doctors, but assumed they were isolated incidents. They wanted me to know that coming forward helped them process their own experiences and recognize the pattern. I cried reading those messages, but they were good tears. Knowing my complaint helped other women understand they weren't alone made everything I went through feel worthwhile. 6 months after the incident at Harrison's office, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I'd slept through the whole night without nightmares. I made coffee and sat on the back porch watching the sun come up and noticed I felt genuinely okay. Not just surviving, but actually doing well. My morning routine felt normal again instead of something I had to force myself through. I scheduled a dentist appointment without having a panic attack about being vulnerable in a medical setting. I went grocery shopping and didn't avoid the aisle where they sold fitness magazines because seeing them didn't trigger flashbacks to Harrison's comments. The trauma hadn't disappeared completely, but it stopped controlling my daily life. I could think about what happened without my chest getting tight and my hands shaking. I could talk about the case without feeling like I might cry. The weight I'd been carrying around for months started to lift and I could breathe easier. I decided to write a detailed review about my experience on 3 different medical rating websites. I used my real name because I wanted other patients to know this actually happened and wasn't just an anonymous complaint. I described exactly what Harrison said during my exam and explained the full process of reporting him through the medical board and filing a civil lawsuit. I outlined the settlement terms, including his license suspension and the policy changes at the practice. I ended each review by saying that if a doctor makes you uncomfortable during an exam, trust your instincts and report it because you deserve better care. Within 2 weeks, 4 other patients added their own reviews about uncomfortable experiences with Harrison. One woman described how he'd pressured her to get cosmetic procedures during what should have been a routine checkup. Another detailed comments he made about her weight that had nothing to do with her actual medical concerns. The pattern became visible to anyone who looked at his ratings, and the reviews created a public record that couldn't be erased or settled away with confidentiality agreements. My husband and I were sitting on the couch one evening watching a movie when he paused it and said he wanted to talk about something. He told me that going through the whole situation with Harrison's case had changed our marriage in ways he didn't expect. Not bad changes, but real ones. He said watching me fight for myself and make decisions about the legal process without needing him to rescue me or tell me what to do made him respect me even more than he already did. He admitted that early in our relationship he'd sometimes tried to solve problems for me instead of supporting me while I solved them myself. The case taught him how to show up for me without trying to control my choices. We talked for over an hour about how we communicate differently now and how we're better at discussing difficult topics without one of us shutting down or getting defensive. We both agreed that navigating a crisis together strengthened our relationship because we learned we could handle hard things as a team. The trauma of what happened was real, but it led to growth in our marriage that wouldn't have happened otherwise. At my next therapy session with Aaliyah, she suggested we try moving to monthly appointments instead of weekly sessions. She said I'd made significant progress in processing the trauma and developing tools to manage anxiety around medical settings. I felt nervous about reducing our sessions because therapy had been such an important anchor for me over the past 6 months. Aaliyah reminded me that I could always increase frequency again if I needed to, and that spacing out sessions was a sign of healing, not abandonment. She pointed out that when we started working together, I was in crisis mode, barely functioning and terrified of all medical appointments. Now I was back to my regular routines, sleeping well, and even volunteering to help other people navigate medical complaints. She said I'd moved through 3 distinct phases from victim to survivor to advocate, and that transition showed real growth. Hearing her frame my progress that way made me realize how far I'd actually come. I agreed to try monthly sessions and left her office feeling proud of myself instead of scared. I joined a patient rights advocacy organization called Medical Justice Alliance that works to improve accountability in healthcare. They needed volunteers to help other people navigate the complaint process when they experience medical mistreatment. My experience with the medical board investigation and civil lawsuit made me a valuable resource because I understood how overwhelming and confusing the system can be. I started taking calls from people who'd had bad experiences with doctors and didn't know what options they had. I walked them through the steps of filing complaints, explained what to expect during investigations, and connected them with attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice. Helping other people advocate for themselves felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Every call I took reminded me that speaking up about Harrison hadn't just helped me, but created a path for others to follow. The local medical community started implementing changes in response to my case and the publicity around it. 3 other medical practices in the area announced new patient feedback systems where people could report concerns either directly or through anonymous third-party services. The hospital where Harrison had privileges before moving to private practice updated their policies to include mandatory ethics training for all physicians. A coalition of women's health providers published new standards for professional conduct during intimate exams, including requirements for chaperones and explicit consent protocols. The Medical Society newsletter featured an article about maintaining patient dignity and respecting boundaries that referenced my case without naming me specifically. Gabriella told me that ripple effects from accountability cases like mine often reach beyond the individual situation and push whole communities to examine their practices. Seeing actual policy changes happen across multiple institutions made me feel like the fight had been worth it. I scheduled my next annual exam with my new doctor without feeling anxious about it for the first time since Harrison's abuse. I walked into the office and filled out the intake forms and sat in the waiting room reading a magazine like it was no big deal. When the nurse called my name, I followed her back without my hands shaking or my heart racing. During the exam, I advocated for myself by asking questions about what my doctor was doing and why, and she answered everything clearly and respectfully. She never made a single comment about my appearance that wasn't directly related to my medical health. She treated me like a whole person, instead of just a body to evaluate. Being able to go through a routine medical appointment and feel safe and respected felt like reclaiming power that Harrison had tried to take away from me. I left the office feeling good about taking care of my health instead of violated and ashamed. My husband and I attended a fundraiser for the Medical Justice Alliance at a hotel downtown on a Thursday evening. The organization was raising money to expand their volunteer program and provide free legal consultations for patients who couldn't afford attorneys. I wore a blue dress and felt nervous about being at an event where people might recognize me from the news coverage about my case. Within 20 minutes of arriving, 3 different people approached me to introduce themselves and share how my case had inspired them to report their own experiences of medical mistreatment. One woman said she'd filed a complaint against her dentist who made inappropriate comments during procedures. Another man described reporting his physical therapist for boundary violations. A third woman was in the middle of a medical board investigation against her former psychiatrist. They all thanked me for speaking publicly about what happened because seeing someone else go through the process gave them courage to come forward. The community impact felt real and tangible in a way that made me emotional. I wasn't just one person who fought back anymore, but part of a larger movement toward accountability. Catherine texted me a few weeks after the fundraiser asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We met at a place near her new workplace on a Saturday morning. She told me about the women's health clinic where she'd been working for the past 3 months and how different the culture was from Harrison's practice. Her new doctors actually listened when staff members raised concerns about patient care. They prioritized patient dignity and comfort, instead of rushing through appointments to maximize billing. The clinic had clear policies about appropriate conduct and took complaints seriously instead of covering them up. Catherine said that standing up as a witness in my case helped her find her own voice professionally because she realized she didn't have to accept toxic work environments or stay silent about unethical behavior. She'd already reported one concerning incident at her new workplace and felt supported by management instead of punished for speaking up. Seeing her thrive in a better situation made me happy because she'd risked a lot by testifying against Harrison. A few months after my coffee meeting with Catherine, I got an email from someone named Dr. Daniela Webb at the State Medical Association. She explained that Harrison's malpractice insurance company had raised his rates by over 300% because of all the complaints and the settlement. Even if he wanted to come back after his suspension ended, the insurance costs would make it almost impossible for him to afford practicing medicine. The market was punishing him in ways that went beyond just the medical board's official actions. I forwarded the email to Gabriella, who responded that financial consequences often proved more effective than formal penalties in keeping bad doctors out of medicine. Harrison wasn't just facing a temporary suspension anymore, but real barriers that would follow him for the rest of his career. Almost exactly a year after the exam room incident, I received an invitation to speak on a panel at the state medical school. The topic was patient-centered care and professional boundaries, and the dean wanted someone who could talk about the real impact of inappropriate medical conduct. I felt nervous about standing in front of future doctors and reliving what happened, but I also saw it as a chance to prevent other patients from going through similar experiences. My husband encouraged me to accept, reminding me how many women had thanked me for speaking up. I agreed to participate and spent the next 2 weeks preparing what I wanted to say. The panel took place in a large lecture hall with about 200 medical students in attendance. I sat between a hospital ethics director and a patient advocacy lawyer while we each gave our presentations. When my turn came, I told them exactly what Harrison had said during my exam and how his words made me feel powerless and violated. I watched the students' faces shift from casual attention to genuine shock as I described the specific comments. After the presentations ended, at least a dozen students came up to thank me and promised they would never treat patients that way. One young woman told me she'd experienced something similar from a doctor during high school and had almost given up on becoming a physician herself. Talking to those future doctors felt like the most meaningful prevention work I could do, because changing medical culture had to start with the people entering the profession. My daily life looked completely normal again by this point, but I noticed real changes in myself that felt positive rather than just recovered. I spoke up immediately now when something felt wrong instead of questioning whether I had the right to object. I knew exactly what my rights were as a patient, and wasn't afraid to advocate for myself in medical settings or anywhere else. The support group I joined had connected me with people working on healthcare reform projects, and I stayed involved because I wanted to help fix the systems that had protected Harrison for so long. The trauma from that exam room hadn't disappeared, but it had led to growth I never expected. I was stronger, more confident, and more connected to a community of people fighting to make healthcare safer and more respectful for everyone. Sitting in my living room one evening about 14 months after everything started, I realized I felt genuinely happy and at peace with how things had turned out. Harrison faced real consequences that would follow him for years, not just a slap on the wrist. Other patients were protected because he couldn't practice anymore, and the medical practice had implemented actual policy changes. The system had been forced to respond in meaningful ways instead of just covering up another complaint. And I had discovered strength I didn't know I had by refusing to stay silent when someone in power abused that position. Sometimes standing up for yourself does more than just heal your own wounds. It helps heal the broken systems that allowed the harm in the first place. My family held an intervention about my love life 6 months after my ex blinded me, and what they said destroyed me more than losing my sight. They called it a family meeting, but when I heard everyone gathering around me in the living room of my parents' house, I knew something was wrong, even though I couldn't see them anymore. Before Kevin threw industrial cleaner in my face, I was finishing my last year of law school and had everything planned out perfectly. I'd broken up with him 3 months earlier because he was getting scary possessive, showing up at my classes, accusing me of cheating when I studied with male classmates, even demanding to put GPS trackers in my bag and car so he could know where I was. The breakup was messy, but I thought it was over until that night in March when I came home from the library and he was waiting in the stairwell of my apartment building. He said if he couldn't have me, then nobody could. Before I knew it, my whole world turned into white searing pain, screaming, and the smell of industrial acid mixed with my own skin melting. Now I was completely blind and had to go undergo 11 surgeries to reconstruct what was left of my face. My nose was mostly gone, my lips were twisted, and the skin that remained was a patchwork of scars and grafts that made children cry when they saw me. I spent my days in physical therapy, counseling sessions, and mobility training with my white cane, living back in my childhood bedroom, and trying to convince myself I could still have some kind of life. So when my family called this meeting, I thought maybe they wanted to talk about me going back to school or moving into an assisted living apartment, not about my love life. My dad cleared his throat and started talking in his careful voice he used for difficult conversations. "Sweetheart, we've all been talking, and we think it's time to discuss your future. specifically your romantic future, because we're worried you're not being realistic about your situation. My sister Janet jumped in, her voice artificially bright like she was selling me something. Kevin writes to you every single day from prison, and Mom and Dad have been reading his letters. They're beautiful, talking about how sorry he is and how he'll spend his life making it up to you. I felt my stomach drop as my best friend Megan added, he's the only man who's ever loved you enough to do something that extreme. And yes, it was wrong, but it shows how deep his feelings are, and he still wants you even after everything. My Aunt Rita chimed in about how his family had money and could pay for experimental treatments in Europe that might restore partial vision and maybe help with more reconstruction. And my brother David, my own brother, said the words that made me want to throw up. We're not saying what he did was right, but you have to admit that no regular guy is going to want to deal with all of this. I could feel him poking around and touching my face. But Kevin already knows what he's getting into. Each new person who spoke made it worse, their voices blending into a chorus of people I loved, telling me that my attacker was my best option. And I realized they'd all been visiting him in prison without telling me. I tried to fight back, my voice shaking as I reminded them that Kevin was the reason I was blind and disfigured, that he'd destroyed my life. But my mother cut me off with that gentle tone she used when I was a child refusing to take medicine. Sweetheart, remember what happened at the cafe last week? We all heard the barista's voice change when she saw you. She had to call someone else to take your order because she couldn't handle looking at you. My sister added, or your dating app matches who ghosted you the second you told them about your face. Suddenly, they were all listing every single rejection, every person who couldn't hide their disgust, every whispered comment I'd pretended not to hear. My dad's voice got soft and he said, when we visited Kevin last week, he cried looking at your pictures and said you're still the most beautiful woman he's ever seen, that he sees past the scars to the real you underneath. I felt my resolve cracking like ice under weight, and I heard myself whisper, he really said that? My mom took my scarred hands in hers and said the words that broke me completely. He's the only one who doesn't see you as a monster baby, because he sees the girl he fell in love with, and that's the best you can do now. The fight went out of me all at once. I'd yet to meet a single person who accepted me after the accident. Everywhere I went, the room went silent as soon as I walked in. I sensed my own friends laughing with their mouths closed or recording me. So when I heard that someone actually thought I still looked beautiful, I found myself really considering it. Maybe they were right. Maybe someone who loved me enough to destroy me was better than nobody at all. Megan pressed an envelope into my shaking hands. Kevin's old cologne was on the paper and it made my heart jump with fear. But my sister took my hand and said, let me read his latest letter. He deserves a second chance after everything he's been through. Janet unfolded the paper and her voice got soft and shaky like she was reading something beautiful, instead of words from the man who burned my face off. She started with how Kevin wakes up every night crying because he sees my face in his dreams, the face from before, and he can't believe what he did to something so perfect. The cologne smell from the envelope was making me sick, and I gripped the arms of my chair so hard my knuckles hurt. Janet kept going, her voice getting more emotional as she read about how Kevin replays that night over and over, wishing he could take it back, how he'd give anything to undo those 5 seconds that destroyed both our lives. She made it sound like some tragic romance instead of attempted murder, and I could feel everyone in the room leaning forward like they were watching a sad movie. My stomach twisted because this was my actual life, my actual blindness, my actual destroyed face, and they were all sitting there getting emotional over Kevin's pain. Janet read the part where Kevin said he watches old videos of us on his phone, the ones from when we first started dating, and he sees past my scars to the real me underneath. He wrote about taking anger management classes twice a week and meeting with the prison chaplain every day because he found God after what he did. My mom squeezed my hand and I heard her sniffle like she was crying, and that's when it hit me that they actually believed this garbage. They'd turned Kevin into some reformed sinner instead of the guy who stalked me for 3 months and threw industrial cleaner in my face when I wouldn't take him back. Janet's voice cracked when she read about how Kevin's therapist says he's made incredible progress, how he's learned to manage his emotions and take responsibility for his actions. I wanted to scream that taking responsibility would mean leaving me alone forever, but my throat felt tight and I couldn't make words come out. The letter went on about how Kevin sees his crime as a blessing in disguise, because it forced him to confront his demons and become the man I always deserved, and I actually felt like I might throw up right there in my parents' living room. I finally found my voice and it came out shaky but loud. I told them this was completely insane, that Kevin didn't just make a mistake or have a bad moment, he tried to murder me and he destroyed my entire life. My dad's voice cut through mine, calm and reasonable like he was explaining something simple to a child. He said Kevin's therapist confirmed everything in the letter, that Kevin really has made progress and isn't the same person he was 6 months ago. Then my dad dropped the bomb that made my blood go cold. He said they've all been meeting with Kevin's family, not just visiting Kevin in prison, but actually sitting down with his parents to discuss a reconciliation plan. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own father had been secretly planning my future with the family of the man who blinded me. My dad kept talking about how Kevin's parents are good people, who are devastated by what their son did, and they want to make things right in any way they can. He said they've been very generous and understanding, and they truly believe Kevin and I belong together despite everything that happened. David jumped in before I could respond, and his voice had that excited tone he gets when he thinks he's figured something out. He told me Kevin's parents already contacted specialists in Germany who've had real success with partial vision restoration in acid attack victims. My brother actually said those words, acid attack victims, like I was some statistic instead of his sister. David explained that these German doctors have new techniques involving stem cells and corneal regeneration, and they've helped people see shapes and light again even years after their injuries. He said Kevin's parents are willing to pay for everything, all the surgeries and treatments and travel and recovery, whatever it takes to give me back some vision. Then he paused and I heard him shift in his chair before he added the condition. They'll pay for everything, but only if I agree to give Kevin another chance, to at least visit him in prison and consider reconciliation. The room went silent and I realized they were all waiting for my reaction, expecting me to jump at the chance to maybe see again. My hands started shaking and I felt trapped in that chair, surrounded by people who were supposed to love me but were basically trying to sell me back to my attacker. Rita's voice came from my left, gentle and persuasive like she was sharing good news. She explained that Kevin's family owns a medical supply company worth millions, that they're very wealthy and very committed to helping me. She said they've already promised to set up a trust fund for my ongoing care, enough money that I'd never have to worry about medical expenses or accessibility equipment or anything I might need for the rest of my life. Rita kept talking about how generous they're being, how they don't have to do any of this but they want to because they care about me and feel responsible for what Kevin did. The way she said it made it sound like they were doing me this huge favor instead of trying to buy me like property. I could hear the excitement in her voice as she listed all the things the trust fund would cover, and I realized with horror that my family had already negotiated my price. They'd sat down with Kevin's parents and worked out exactly how much my face and my eyes and my future were worth, and now they were presenting it to me like I should be grateful. Megan's voice surprised me because I'd almost forgotten she was there. She started talking about how hard prison has been for Kevin, how the other inmates found out what he did, and they target him constantly. She said he gets beaten up regularly because prisoners hate guys who hurt women, and he's had to be moved to protective custody twice for his safety. Megan's voice got softer as she described how Kevin's scared all the time, how he can't sleep because he's afraid someone will attack him in his cell. She actually said he suffered too, like getting beat up in prison was somehow equal to being permanently blinded and disfigured. I wanted to scream that Kevin chose to throw acid in my face, that nobody forced him to destroy me, but my throat felt paralyzed and I couldn't make any sound come out. Megan kept going about how Kevin's lost weight and has nightmares and cries during their visits, and I sat there realizing that my best friend felt more sorry for my attacker than she did for me. My mom started crying, those soft hiccuping sobs she does when she's really upset. Her voice came out all watery and broken as she told me she's terrified I'll spend my whole life alone. She said no regular man is going to want to deal with my situation, with my blindness and my face and all the care I need. My mom actually said those words out loud, that no one will want me, and each word hit like a physical punch to my stomach. She kept crying as she talked about lying awake at night worrying about what happens to me when she and my dad are gone. Who will take care of me? Who will love me? Then she said at least Kevin already knows what he's getting into. At least he's seen my face and he still wants me. Her words made me feel like something disgusting that people have to force themselves to accept. Like my own mother saw me as this damaged thing that should be grateful for any attention at all. Part of me wanted to argue, but another part, the part that remembered every person who'd gasped or turned away or couldn't hide their disgust when they saw me, wondered if she was right. Janet's hands pressed the letter into mine and the paper felt heavy and wrong. She told me I didn't have to decide anything right now, that I should just think about it and take my time. But I could hear the expectation in everyone's voices, that weird, excited energy of people who think they've solved a problem. They weren't really giving me a choice. They'd already decided I should get back together with Kevin, and now they were just waiting for me to accept it, like it was inevitable. Janet squeezed my shoulder and said, Kevin deserves a second chance, that everyone makes mistakes, and love means forgiveness. My dad added something about how rare it is to find someone who loves you enough to want you back after everything, and I wanted to laugh at how twisted that sounded. They'd rewritten the whole story in their heads, turned Kevin's attack into some proof of his deep feelings instead of what it really was. I stood up fast and my chair scraped against the floor. I grabbed my cane and started moving toward the hallway, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep my grip. I heard my mom call after me, but I kept going, counting steps to my bedroom door the way my mobility instructor taught me. Behind me, I could hear them all talking in those lowered voices people use when they think you can't hear, discussing me like I was a problem they needed to solve. Janet said something about me being emotional and needing time to process. David said I was being stubborn and unrealistic about my options. My dad's voice rumbled something about tough love and doing what's best even when it's hard. For the first time since Kevin attacked me, I felt more trapped than I did back when he was stalking me, showing up everywhere I went, demanding to know where I was every minute. At least then I could see the danger coming. Now I was blind and surrounded by people who claimed to love me while pushing me back toward the person who destroyed me. I made it to my bed and lay down still holding Kevin's letter. The cologne smell was everywhere now, filling my nose and making my head spin. I couldn't read the words myself, couldn't see what he actually wrote, and I hated being dependent on Janet's dramatic reading to know what was in it. The smell brought back that night in the stairwell so clearly I could almost feel it happening again. Kevin's voice saying if he couldn't have me then nobody could. The sound of liquid splashing. The split second before the pain hit when I didn't understand what was happening. Then the white-hot agony and the screaming, my screaming, and the chemical smell mixing with burning skin. Kevin had used almost those exact same words in his letter, according to Janet, talking about how much he loved me, how he couldn't imagine life without me. My family was actually asking me to go back to the person who permanently blinded me and melted my face because they thought I was too damaged for anyone else to want. I lay there in my childhood bed holding that letter and realized my family saw me the same way strangers did, as something ruined and pitiful that should take whatever scraps of affection it could get, even from the person who ruined me in the first place. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door opening and the smell of eggs and toast. My mom's footsteps crossed the room and I heard her set a tray on my nightstand. She sat down on the edge of my bed and the mattress dipped under her weight. Her hand touched my shoulder in that soft way she used when I was sick as a kid. She started talking in her gentle voice about forgiveness and how it was the path to healing. She told me Kevin's mother cried the whole time they met, actually sobbing into her hands while begging for a chance to make things right. My mom asked if I really wanted to be the kind of person who held on to bitterness instead of choosing to heal. I pulled my blanket up higher and turned my face away from her voice. She kept going, saying Kevin's mother was a good woman who raised her son wrong but wanted to fix her mistakes. I didn't eat the breakfast and I didn't answer her questions. After a while, she picked up the tray and left, closing the door harder than necessary. I stayed in bed most of the day, listening to the sounds of the house around me. Around noon, I heard voices in the hallway right outside my door. Janet was talking to our parents and her voice carried through the thin wood. She said I was being stubborn and unrealistic about my situation. She told them I needed to accept my new limitations and stop living in some fantasy land where I had options. My dad's voice rumbled something I couldn't make out, and then Janet said something about how I was making this harder on everyone. David joined in, and I heard him say I was being selfish, that the whole family was trying to help me and I was throwing it back in their faces. My mom said something about tough love, and how sometimes you had to be firm with people who couldn't see what was good for them. I pressed my pillow over my head, but I could still hear their voices discussing me like I was a problem that needed solving. Later that afternoon, my dad knocked on my door and came in without waiting for an answer. He sat in the chair near my bed and I could hear him shifting his weight like he was uncomfortable. He started talking about my future and how worried he was about me. He said I would need expensive care for the rest of my life, medical appointments and assistive technology, and maybe home health aides as I got older. He talked about how Kevin's family could provide all of that, how they had the money to make sure I was taken care of properly. His voice got softer, and he said sometimes love meant making practical choices instead of emotional ones. He told me this was my chance at real financial security, that I needed to think about the long term instead of just my feelings right now. I felt something break inside me, and suddenly I was crying. Really crying for the first time since the intervention started. I admitted I was scared of being alone forever. I told him about going to the grocery store last week and hearing a kid ask his mom what was wrong with my face. I talked about how every time I left the house I felt people staring at me, could hear them going quiet when I walked past. My dad moved to sit on the bed and pulled me into a hug. He said that was exactly why Kevin made sense. Kevin already knew what he was getting into. Kevin had accepted me once and he was willing to do it again. My dad's shirt smelled like his aftershave and I cried into it while he patted my back. He said I needed to be realistic about my options now. That evening I heard Megan's voice downstairs and then footsteps coming up to my room. She knocked and came in, her perfume filling the small space. She sat on the bed and told me she brought another letter from Kevin, that this one was even more emotional than the last. She opened the envelope and started reading parts out loud. Kevin wrote about dreaming of taking care of me, about making up for what he did through actions instead of just words. He talked about imagining a future where he proved his love every single day. Megan's voice got shaky reading it like she was moved by his words. She folded the letter and pressed it into my hands. I held the paper and asked her if she really thought I should get back together with someone who blinded me. She was quiet for a few seconds and I could hear her breathing. Then she said Kevin made a terrible mistake, but people could change. She said he was getting therapy in prison and taking classes to be a better person. Then her voice got harder and she added that my dating profile got 0 matches after I posted honest photos of my face. She asked what other choice I really had. I felt the letter crumpling in my grip. Megan stayed a while longer talking about how rare it was to find someone who wanted you after something like this. After she left, I lay in the dark holding both of Kevin's letters. That night, I barely slept. Kevin's words from both letters kept spinning in my head mixed with everything my family said. Part of me felt sick thinking about getting back together with him. I remembered the pain of the acid hitting my face and the smell of my skin burning. But another part of me was so desperate for someone to accept me that I found myself considering it. I thought about being alone in my childhood bedroom for the rest of my life. I thought about how my own family believed I had no other options. Maybe they were right. Maybe someone who destroyed me was better than nobody at all. The next day, I told my mom I wanted to talk to my old therapist from the hospital. Dr. Sarah had helped me right after the attack when I was learning to live without sight. My mom's voice got tight and cold. She said that therapist had filled my head with victim mentality and made me think I was helpless. But she said she would allow one session if it helped me process things and move forward. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor. 2 days later, I sat in Dr. Sarah's office, and the moment I started explaining the intervention, her voice changed completely. She stopped me after I described my family reading Kevin's letters and told me directly that what they were doing was abuse. She said they were trying to force me back into a relationship with my attacker. I felt my throat get tight, and I tried to explain that they just wanted what was best for me. Dr. Sarah cut me off and said no family that wanted what was best would pressure someone to reconcile with the person who blinded them. She asked me to describe exactly what happened at the intervention, and I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she started talking about something called trauma bonding. She explained how my family was using my vulnerability to push their own agenda. Then she asked if I had considered that they might benefit financially from Kevin's family's wealth. The words hit me like cold water. I thought about David mentioning the job offer. I remembered my dad talking about expensive care, and Kevin's family paying for treatments. Dr. Sarah said my family had made deals with Kevin's family behind my back, and now they were trying to deliver me like I was part of a business arrangement. Everything suddenly clicked into a darker pattern, and I realized my family had been negotiating my future for their own benefit. I took a cab home from Dr. Sarah's office because I couldn't stand the thought of asking my mom for a ride after what I'd just learned. My hands shook the whole way as I gripped my white cane, and when I walked through the front door, I heard my mom's footsteps coming fast from the kitchen. She asked how therapy went, and her voice had that fake cheerful tone that meant she already knew something was wrong. I told her exactly what Dr. Sarah said, that my family was trying to force me back with my attacker, that they'd made deals behind my back. My mom's voice changed instantly, and she started yelling that Dr. Sarah was a troublemaker who didn't understand family loyalty. She said therapists like that filled vulnerable people's heads with paranoid ideas and turned them against the people who actually loved them. I tried to explain that Dr. Sarah was just helping me see the truth, but my mom cut me off and said I wasn't allowed to see that woman again. She told me Dr. Sarah was poisoning my mind against people who only wanted what was best for me, and if I kept seeing her, I'd end up completely alone with nobody. I felt my stomach drop because I realized my mom saw Dr. Sarah as a threat to whatever plan they'd made with Kevin's family. My mom kept going, saying real families stuck together through hard times and didn't let outsiders come between them. She said I was influenced by someone who didn't know our situation and didn't care about my future the way they did. I went to my room and shut the door, my whole body shaking with anger and fear. I lay on my bed trying to process everything when I heard my brother David's footsteps coming down the hall hours later after it got dark outside. He knocked once and came in without waiting for an answer. His voice sounded different from usual, harder and more aggressive than I'd ever heard it. He sat on the edge of my bed and told me Kevin's dad had offered him a job at their medical supply company. The job paid almost double what he made now and came with benefits and stock options. Then his voice got even colder, and he said, if I messed this up for the family, he would never forgive me. I felt sick as I realized my brother was threatening me over a job offer from my attacker's family. David said Kevin's dad was only offering the position because they were trying to build bridges between our families, and if I kept refusing to cooperate, the whole deal would fall apart. He told me I needed to think about someone besides myself for once, and consider how my choices affected everyone else. I asked him if he seriously expected me to get back together with Kevin, so he could have a better job. David was quiet for a second, and then he admitted something that made my blood run cold. He said our parents were drowning in my medical bills from all the surgeries and treatments after the attack. Kevin's family had offered to pay everything retroactively, every single bill, if I agreed to give Kevin another chance. I realized with complete horror that my family had been negotiating deals with Kevin's family behind my back for months. This wasn't about my romantic future or my happiness at all. This was about their financial futures and what they could get out of Kevin's family's money. David kept talking and said the medical bills were over $200,000, and our parents had taken out a second mortgage on the house to cover them. Kevin's family offering to pay it all off would save our parents from losing everything. He made it sound like I owed it to them to cooperate after they'd spent so much money on my recovery. I told him that Kevin was the reason I needed all those surgeries in the first place, that it was his fault our parents had those bills. David said that was beside the point now, and we had to deal with reality, not what should have happened. He left my room, and I heard his footsteps going back downstairs. I was still lying there trying to process what he'd said when I heard Janet's lighter footsteps coming up about 20 minutes later. She knocked softly and asked if she could come in, her voice much gentler than David's had been. She sat next to me and took my hand, and I could smell her perfume that she always wore. Janet said she knew David came on too strong and she wanted to try a different approach. She told me Kevin's family was just trying to help, and what was wrong with everyone benefiting from the situation. She said it wasn't like Kevin's family was asking for anything crazy, just a chance for me to talk to Kevin and see if we could work things out. Janet kept using that soft, reasonable voice as she explained how hard this had been on the whole family, not just me. She said Mom and Dad were stressed about money, David was struggling at his dead-end job, and even she was worried about her own student loans. If Kevin's family wanted to help everyone while also helping me get treatments that might restore some vision, why was I being so stubborn about it? She told me I was being selfish by not considering how my choices affected everyone who loved me. Janet said they weren't asking me to marry Kevin tomorrow, just to give him a chance to prove he'd changed. I didn't answer her, and after a while she squeezed my hand and left. I spent the next 2 days locked in my room refusing to eat or talk to anyone. My mom brought food that I barely touched, and I heard her sighing outside my door. I could hear my family discussing me through the walls and vents, their voices carrying up from the living room below. My mom said I was being dramatic and needed tough love to snap out of it. My dad agreed and said maybe they should just set up a meeting with Kevin's parents and make me go. Janet suggested they could drive me there and not tell me where we were going until we arrived. I lay in my bed listening to them plan ways to force me into doing what they wanted, and I felt more trapped than I ever had. On the second day, I heard Aunt Rita's voice downstairs talking to my mom. Her footsteps came up to my room and she knocked, calling my name in her cheerful aunt voice. I didn't answer, but she came in anyway and sat on my bed. She said she'd been doing research on the German treatment Kevin's family mentioned, and it was actually real. The doctors in Berlin had a clinic that specialized in acid attack victims, and they'd had success with partial vision restoration in some cases. Aunt Rita described how the treatment worked using stem cells and new surgical techniques, and she said I could potentially see shapes and light again, even if not full vision. Her voice got more serious, and she asked if my pride was really worth staying blind when Kevin's family was offering me a legitimate chance at partial vision. She said she understood I was angry at Kevin, but I needed to think practically about my future. Aunt Rita told me I was young and had my whole life ahead of me, and turning down a chance to see again just because I was mad seemed like cutting off my nose to spite my face. She stayed for a while longer trying to convince me, but I kept my face turned toward the wall. After she left, I lay there thinking about what she said, and hating that part of me wanted to believe it was possible. But then I remembered Dr. Sarah's words about my family exploiting my vulnerability, and I knew I needed help from someone outside this house. I got up and felt my way to the phone in the hallway using my cane. I called information and asked for disability services in my area. The operator was patient and connected me to a support center, and a woman answered saying this was the Community Resource Center. I asked if they had services for assault survivors with disabilities, and the woman said yes and transferred me to someone named Kira, who ran support groups. Kira's voice was warm when she answered, and I started explaining my situation, stumbling over the words about my family and Kevin and the pressure to reconcile. Kira didn't sound shocked at all as I talked. She told me this happened more often than people thought, that families sometimes pressured disabled victims to reconcile with their abusers because they saw them as burdens. Her matter-of-fact tone about it made me feel less crazy for the first time in days. Kira said she'd worked with dozens of women in similar situations where families prioritized their own needs over the victim's safety and recovery. She asked me a few questions about my living situation and support system, and I admitted I was living with my parents and had basically no one on my side. Kira invited me to a support group meeting the next evening and said she could send a mobility instructor to help me get there independently if I needed it. For the first time in days, I felt like someone was treating me as capable instead of helpless. She gave me the address and meeting time and said she looked forward to meeting me in person. I hung up feeling something like hope starting to grow in my chest. I went back to my room, and that evening at dinner, I told my mom I was going to a support group meeting tomorrow. My mom's voice got sharp immediately, and she asked if this was the one Dr. Sarah recommended. When I said yes, she told me I wasn't allowed to go. She said I was influenced by people who didn't know our family situation and didn't understand what we were trying to do for me. My mom added that support groups like that just made people more bitter and angry instead of helping them move forward with their lives. I pushed myself up from the bed and felt my way to the doorway where I could hear my mom still standing in the hall. I told her I was an adult, and I was going to that meeting tomorrow whether she liked it or not. The silence that followed felt heavy and cold, and when my mom finally spoke, her voice had changed completely from the gentle tone she'd been using. She said fine, if I wanted to go, so badly then I could find my own way there because she wasn't going to drive me anywhere to meet with people who would turn me against my own family. I heard her footsteps going down the hall, and her bedroom door closing hard enough to make the walls shake. I went back into my room and sat on the edge of my bed trying to stop my hands from shaking, because I'd never talked to my mom like that before, not even when I had my sight and my independence. The next morning, I got up early and felt my way to the phone in the hallway, using the skills my mobility instructor had taught me during rehab. I called information and asked for paratransit services, and the operator connected me to a scheduling line where I explained I needed a ride to an address across town for that evening. The person taking my information was patient and professional, confirming my pickup time and location without making me feel helpless or broken. My family barely spoke to me all day, and when evening came, I heard my mom telling my dad in the kitchen that I was making a huge mistake. I ignored them and waited by the front door with my cane until I heard the paratransit van pull up outside. Getting into the van by myself felt scary, but also good in a way I hadn't felt since before the attack, like I was taking back some small piece of control over my own life. The driver helped me find my seat and told me we'd be there in about 20 minutes, and I spent the whole ride feeling proud of myself for doing this alone. When we arrived at the community center, I used my cane to navigate from the van to the building entrance, counting steps and listening for the sound of the automatic doors. Inside, a woman's voice asked if I was here for the support group, and when I said yes, she told me her name was Kira, and she was glad I'd made it. She guided me down a hallway to a room where I could hear other people talking quietly, and as we entered, the conversation stopped for just a second before continuing. Kira introduced me to the group, and I heard 4 different women's voices welcoming me, and not one of them gasped or changed their tone when they saw my face. 2 of the women mentioned they were also blind from partner violence, and another woman came over and took my hand to guide it to her face so I could feel scars similar to mine. For the first time since the attack, I was in a room where nobody was staring at me with horror or pity, where my injuries were just understood as part of what had happened to us. When it was my turn to share, I told them about the intervention and how my family wanted me to reconcile with Kevin because they thought no one else would want me. The room went completely silent for a moment, and then one woman said her parents had done almost the same thing, pressuring her to go back to her ex-husband who'd beaten her so badly she lost hearing in one ear. Another woman shared how her sister kept telling her she was being unreasonable by refusing to forgive the boyfriend who'd thrown her down the stairs and paralyzed her legs. A third woman talked about her mother visiting her attacker in jail and trying to arrange meetings without her permission, and I realized with relief and sadness that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. After the meeting ended, Kira came over with a man she introduced as her husband Brian, and he told me he was a disability rights attorney who worked with assault survivors. Brian explained that what my family was doing could actually be considered coercion, especially since they were using my dependency on them to pressure me into contact with my attacker. He said I had legal rights they were violating and he'd be happy to consult with me for free about my options. I took his card and thanked him, feeling something like hope starting to build in my chest for the first time in weeks. The paratransit driver picked me up at 9, and by the time I got home it was almost 10, way past when my family usually went to bed. But when I came through the front door, I could hear them all waiting in the living room, and my dad's voice cut through the darkness demanding to know where I'd been and what I'd talked about. I told him I went to a support group and met other women who'd survived attacks like mine, and my sister Janet made a scoffing sound and said those women were probably just bitter and alone, poisoning my mind against people who actually cared about me. My mom's voice was tight when she told me she'd called Kevin's mother while I was gone, and they'd arranged a meeting for this weekend at a restaurant halfway between our houses. I felt my stomach drop and I said I never agreed to meet with them, but my mom cut me off saying I was being unreasonable, and I owed them at least a conversation after everything their family had offered to do for me. I barely slept that night thinking about being forced into a room with Kevin's parents, and first thing the next morning I dug out Brian's card and called his office. When he answered, I explained what my family was trying to do, and Brian told me clearly that I had every right to refuse this meeting and no one could force me to attend. He offered to come with me as my legal advocate if I wanted to go but needed support, and I felt the panic in my chest ease just a little, knowing I had someone on my side. That afternoon, I told my family I would only go to the meeting if Brian came with me as my attorney, and my dad exploded asking why I needed a lawyer for a simple family discussion. His anger at the mention of legal representation made me more certain than ever that I needed Brian there, because people who have nothing to hide don't get mad about lawyers being present. My mom tried a different approach after my dad's yelling didn't work, and I heard her crying as she told me I was tearing the family apart and making everything so much harder than it needed to be. She said Kevin's family would think we were being hostile if I brought a lawyer, that it would ruin any chance of working things out peacefully. But I stayed firm and told her Brian came with me, or I wasn't going at all. And I heard my mom leave the room still crying while my dad muttered about how I'd changed into someone they didn't recognize anymore. 3 days later, I sat in a booth at the restaurant Brian chose, my hands gripping my cane while I listened to footsteps approaching our table. I heard Kevin's parents arrive first, and the way their voices stopped mid-greeting when Brian introduced himself as my attorney made the tension in the air thick enough to feel. Kevin's father cleared his throat and started talking in this rehearsed way that reminded me of a business presentation, going on about how their son was filled with remorse and how they wanted to help me through financial support for my ongoing medical needs. His voice was smooth and practiced, like he'd said these exact words to a mirror before coming here. Brian let him finish before asking what specific expectations they had in return for this financial assistance, and the silence that followed told me everything. Kevin's mother jumped in with a softer approach, her voice shaking as she explained that they hoped I would consider visiting their son in prison, because he was devastated that I wouldn't read his letters or respond to any of his attempts to communicate. She made it sound like I was being cruel by not engaging with the man who threw acid in my face. Brian asked more questions about the terms of their offer, and Kevin's father mentioned the German treatment again, adding that they'd already contacted specialists who were ready to evaluate me as soon as I agreed to come. But when Brian pushed for details about what would happen if the treatment failed, or if I still refused to reconcile with Kevin afterward, both parents got defensive, and Kevin's father said they were just trying to help and didn't appreciate being interrogated. I felt my hands start shaking, and I finally spoke up, my voice coming out stronger than I expected, as I asked them directly if they understood that their son tried to murder me, that he permanently destroyed my vision and my face and my entire future. Kevin's mother started crying immediately, and said it was a moment of temporary insanity brought on by the stress of our breakup, that Kevin wasn't a monster and he'd been getting help in prison. She kept saying he was sick that day, like throwing industrial cleaner in someone's face was just a bad cold he caught. I heard Brian shift in his seat and his voice went cold and professional as he stated clearly that I wasn't interested in any form of reconciliation, and that all future contact attempts needed to go through him as my legal representative. Kevin's parents both started talking at once, their voices rising as they said I was being unreasonable and throwing away a chance at a better life. But Brian stood up and I felt his hand on my elbow guiding me out of the booth. I could hear my own family's furious whispers as we walked to the parking lot, their voices carrying across the restaurant about how I'd embarrassed them and ruined everything. The drive home with my parents were completely silent for the first 10 minutes, until my dad finally said I'd just thrown away my only chance at a normal life, and did I realize what I'd done. I told him that getting back together with my attacker wasn't normal, and he made this disgusted sound before saying that beggars can't be choosers given my situation. My mom didn't say anything during the drive, but I could hear her crying quietly in the front seat. When we got back to the house, I went straight to my room. But my mom followed me in and told me I needed to start looking for somewhere else to live if I was going to reject help and make everything harder for the family. Her voice wasn't sad anymore. It was cold and matter-of-fact, as she explained they couldn't afford to support me forever, and I needed to figure out my own living situation. I felt panic rising in my chest because I had no idea how to live independently while blind, and my mom just walked out of my room without another word. I fumbled for my phone and called Kira, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice before she answered. She listened while I explained what happened at the meeting and what my mom had just said, and then she told me to hold on while she made another call. 2 minutes later, she was back and said she was connecting me with Alana, a counselor who worked specifically with assault survivors transitioning to independent living. Alana's voice was calm and warm when she came on the line, and she started listing off accessible apartments and financial assistance programs I qualified for that I'd never even heard of before. She said she could help me apply for disability benefits, housing assistance, and vocational training services that would cover most of my living expenses. I felt something like hope starting to push through the panic, as Alana explained how many resources existed that my family had never told me about. Over the next week, Alana met with me every single day, helping me fill out applications and navigate the complicated process of accessing disability services. She brought paperwork and formats I could actually use and read everything out loud to me, explaining each form and what it meant for my future. I learned about monthly disability payments I could receive, subsidized housing programs for people with disabilities, and job training services that would help me find work I could do despite being blind. Every new program Alana told me about made me angrier, because I realized my family had kept me dependent on purpose, never mentioning any of these resources that could have given me independence months ago. My mom barely spoke to me that whole week except to ask when I'd be leaving, and my sister Janet stopped coming by the house completely. Alana helped me apply for everything at once and told me the housing assistance would probably come through first, since there was an accessible building with an opening right now. She described the apartment as a studio in a building designed specifically for residents with disabilities, with other blind and physically disabled people living there, and support services available on site. The rent would be affordable with my assistance payments, and I'd have access to orientation and mobility instructors who could help me learn to navigate my new neighborhood. When Alana told me there was an apartment available and asked if I wanted to apply, I said yes without even thinking about it. 2 days later, she called to say my application was approved, and I could move in at the end of the month. For the first time since Kevin threw acid in my face, I felt excited about my future instead of trapped and hopeless. I had my own place waiting for me, money coming in to cover my expenses, and people who actually wanted to help me succeed instead of keeping me small and dependent. The apartment was mine, and nobody could take it away from me or use it to control me, and that feeling of ownership over my own life made me want to cry with relief. I called my parents that same evening to tell them about the apartment, and my dad answered with his usual tired voice asking what I needed. I told him I found a place to live and would be moving out at the end of the month, and the silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him calling for my mom and Janet, and suddenly they were all on speakerphone asking what I meant and why I was doing this to them. Janet's voice came through sharp and angry, saying I was abandoning them after everything they'd done for me, after they took me in and cared for me when I was helpless. My mom started crying immediately, her sobs loud and dramatic, saying I was making a huge mistake, and I'd come crawling back when reality hit me. I tried to explain about the disability benefits and housing assistance, about how Alana had helped me access resources I never knew existed, but Janet cut me off and said I was manipulated by strangers who didn't really care about me. My dad's voice was cold when he said I was being selfish and ungrateful, throwing their help back in their faces, and I should think very carefully about burning bridges with my only family. I told them the decision was final and hung up before they could say more, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The next day, David showed up at the house while I was packing boxes in my room, and I heard his footsteps coming down the hall before he even knocked. He pushed my door open and told me Kevin's dad had called him that morning to rescind the job offer at the medical supply company. David's voice was tight with anger as he explained that Kevin's family heard I'd rejected the meeting with their lawyers present, and now they wanted nothing to do with our family. He said I'd cost him a 6-figure salary and benefits, that he'd been counting on that job to finally get ahead, and now it was gone because I couldn't just be reasonable for once. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized my family had been making deals and plans around Kevin's family's money, that this whole thing had never really been about my happiness or well-being. David kept talking, listing all the things my medical bills had cost the family, how they'd sacrificed for me, and now I was costing him opportunities too. I told him to get out of my room, and he slammed the door so hard the whole wall shook, and I heard him downstairs telling my parents I was being vindictive and spiteful. The rest of that week, I avoided my family as much as possible, spending my time at Alana's office or the support group space, and when moving day finally came, Kira showed up with 2 other women from the group and a borrowed van. They helped me carry my boxes and bags down the stairs while my mom watched from the doorway without offering to help, her face set in disapproving lines. My dad had already left for work without saying goodbye, and Janet didn't come out of her room at all. The apartment Alana had found was perfect, a studio space in a building designed specifically for residents with disabilities, with wide doorways and accessible features throughout. Kira and the other women helped me unpack and organize everything, placing furniture where I could navigate easily with my cane, and Alana had already set up tactile markers and labels so I could find things independently. It was small, but it was mine, completely mine, and nobody could use it to control me or make me feel like I owed them anything. When everyone left that evening, I sat on my new couch in my own apartment and felt that same relief wash over me again, mixed with loneliness, but also freedom. My family stopped calling after I moved out, and the silence felt strange at first, like a constant background noise had suddenly cut off. I kept expecting my mom to call with some emergency, or my sister to text asking for something, but days passed with nothing. Then a week later, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan, just one message saying I was selfish for pushing everyone away, and I'd regret it when I ended up alone. She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life, and nobody would be there to pick up the pieces when it all fell apart. Before I could respond, another message came through saying she was blocking my number, and I shouldn't try to contact her again. I stared at my phone screen for a long time after that, using the voice reader to hear the messages over and over, and part of me wanted to call her back and apologize. But the bigger part of me felt relieved that I didn't have to pretend anymore with people who thought Kevin was my best option. Alana connected me with Austin a few days later, Kira's son who worked with accessibility technology for people with visual impairments. He came to my apartment with bags full of equipment and spent hours setting everything up, explaining each piece as he worked. He installed screen readers on my laptop and phone that would read everything out loud in a natural voice, voice-activated systems that let me control lights and appliances by speaking, and apps that helped me identify objects and navigate spaces independently. Austin showed me how to use each tool patiently, never making me feel stupid when I asked him to repeat instructions, and by the end of the day, I felt more capable than I had in months. I could check my email, browse websites, even read books again using the technology, and the world suddenly felt less closed off. Austin said he'd check in weekly to make sure everything was working and teach me new features, and he gave me his number in case I needed help with anything. 2 weeks after moving in, Alana brought a vocational counselor to my apartment, a woman who specialized in helping people with disabilities return to work or school. We sat at my small kitchen table and she asked about my background, my law school experience, what I'd been studying before the attack. I explained about my last year of law school that I'd never finished, how I'd been so close to graduating, and she didn't sound doubtful or pitying when she responded. She told me about adaptive technology for legal work, screen readers that could handle legal documents, voice recognition software for writing briefs, programs designed specifically for blind lawyers and law students. We discussed distance learning programs in schools with strong disability support services, and she said my law career wasn't over unless I wanted it to be. She pulled up information about several programs on her laptop and used my screen reader to show me what was available, and I felt hope starting to build again for the first time since Kevin threw acid in my face. The counselor said she'd help me apply and navigate the accommodation process, that plenty of blind people practice law successfully, and I didn't have to give up on the future I'd planned. 3 months passed in my new apartment. 3 months of learning to navigate independently and building routines that worked for me. I was getting ready for bed one evening when I heard something slide under my door, the soft scrape of paper on tile. I used my cane to find it and picked up an envelope, running my fingers over it until I found the return address label in raised print. My mom's address. I used my phone's camera app to read the letter out loud, and her words came through the speaker in that artificial voice. She wrote that Kevin was up for parole review soon, and his family was very angry that I wouldn't write a support letter for him. She said I was being vindictive and cruel, that Kevin had served his time and deserved a second chance, and my refusal to help him showed how hard my heart had become. The letter went on about forgiveness and moving forward, about how disappointed she was in the person I'd turned into, and I didn't even finish listening before I ripped it up and threw it in the trash. At support group that week, I shared about the letter and my progress over the past 3 months, how I'd been learning to live independently and access resources. The other women celebrated with me, their voices warm and genuinely happy, and one woman who'd been in the group for 2 years spoke up. She told me the first year after cutting off toxic family was the hardest, that I'd doubt myself and feel guilty, but it would get easier with time. She said I was doing everything right by building my own support system and focusing on my own healing instead of managing everyone else's expectations. Kira suggested I might benefit from expanding my social circle beyond the support group, and she told me about a social group for young adults with visual impairments that met twice a month. I went to the next meeting feeling nervous, using my cane to navigate into a community center where I could hear people talking and laughing. Someone greeted me at the door and guided me to a chair, and within minutes I was part of a conversation about accessible technology and funny stories about navigating the world as a blind person. Nobody made a big deal about my scars or acted like I was fragile or broken, and a guy named Marcus ended up sitting next to me for most of the evening. We talked about our lives and interests, and at the end of the night he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. My immediate reaction was fear, that old voice in my head saying nobody would really want me, but I pushed past it and said yes. The coffee date happened 3 days later at a cafe near my apartment, and Marcus was already there when I arrived, his voice calling out to help me find his table. We talked for 2 hours about everything from our jobs to our families to our favorite music, and he never once made my blindness or scars into a thing that needed addressing. He told me about his work in audio engineering and asked about my plans to return to law school, treating me like a normal person with a normal life instead of a victim who needed saving. When we left the cafe, he asked if he could see me again, and I realized my family had been completely wrong about nobody ever wanting me. Marcus saw me as a whole person, not just my disabilities or my trauma, and that feeling of being treated normally was better than any promise Kevin's family could have made. A few weeks after that coffee date with Marcus, I got an email from a distance learning program that made my screen reader go crazy with excitement. They accepted me into their law degree completion program, designed specifically for students with disabilities, and I could start the next semester with full accommodations, including audio textbooks, extended test times, and accessible course materials. I sat in my apartment listening to the acceptance letter read aloud 3 times because I couldn't believe it was real, that I was actually going back to finish what Kevin's attack had interrupted. The program coordinator called me the next day to discuss my needs, and she treated the whole thing like it was completely normal. Like blind students finished law degrees all the time, and I was just another person working toward their goals. I started telling everyone in my support group about it, and they celebrated with me, sharing their own stories about going back to the school or work after their attacks. Kira hugged me after the meeting and told me this was exactly the kind of progress she loved seeing, that education and independence were the best revenge against people who tried to destroy you. Brian called me 2 days later and asked if I wanted to meet him at his office to discuss something. I took the bus there using my mobility skills, and felt proud navigating the route by myself, and when I arrived, his secretary guided me to his office where he was waiting. He told me he'd been impressed with how I handled the meeting with Kevin's parents, and how I advocated for myself throughout the whole process with my family. Then he offered me a part-time internship at his disability rights firm, helping with research and client intake, working around my class schedule once school started. The pay wasn't much, but it was real legal work, and he said I could use it for my required internship credits toward graduation. I accepted immediately and started the following week, learning how to use legal databases with my screen reader and taking notes during client consultations. The work felt meaningful in a way my old law school classes never had, because I was helping real people navigate systems that weren't designed for them. Brian told me after my first month that I had a real future in disability advocacy law, that my personal experience combined with legal knowledge made me uniquely qualified to help others. 6 months after I left my family's house, I got a notification that Kevin's parole hearing was scheduled, and I had the right to attend via phone to give a victim impact statement. My hands shook when I called the number on the appointed day, and waited on hold listening to generic music until someone transferred me into the hearing room. I could hear Kevin's voice for the first time since that night in the stairwell, and it made my stomach turn, hearing him tell the parole board about his rehabilitation and remorse. Then it was my turn, and I read the statement I'd prepared with Brian's help, explaining in detail how Kevin's attack destroyed my vision and face, how I'd undergone 11 surgeries and would need more, how I'd lost my career path and independence. I talked about the chronic pain from my facial injuries and how I'd never see my own face again, or watch a sunset or read a physical book. Then I added the part about my family's intervention, and how their pressure to reconcile with my attacker had added trauma to my recovery, how Kevin's family had tried to use money to buy my forgiveness. My voice stayed steady through the whole thing, even though I was shaking, and when I finished, there was silence on the line before the board chair thanked me for my statement. The decision came a week later, and Kevin's parole was denied. He would serve his full sentence with no early release, and I felt something release in my chest when Brian called to tell me the news. But 2 days after that, Brian called again saying Kevin's parents had tried to contact me through his office, leaving messages asking me to reconsider reconciliation now that I was doing better. They claimed Kevin's denial was partially my fault because of my statement, and they wanted to discuss how we could all move forward as a family. Brian sent them a cease and desist letter on my behalf that same day, making it clear any further contact would result in a restraining order. He told me Kevin's parents were used to buying their way out of problems, and they couldn't accept that some things weren't for sale. My mom called for the first time in months on a random Tuesday afternoon. Her voice sounded different and smaller than I remembered, less confident and more uncertain. She said she'd been thinking about what happened at that intervention, and maybe they pushed too hard, that she'd been talking to her own therapist about it. But then she added that she still thought they were trying to help me, that their intentions were good, even if their methods were wrong. She asked how I was doing, and if I was managing okay on my own, and I could hear the hope in her voice that I'd admit I was struggling and needed to come back home. I took a breath and told my mom that pressuring me to reconcile with my attacker wasn't help. It was abuse. I explained that good intentions didn't matter, when the actions caused harm, and until she could fully acknowledge what they did was wrong without qualifications or excuses, I wasn't ready to rebuild our relationship. She started crying on the phone, and I heard her say she missed me and didn't understand why I was being so harsh. But she didn't argue with my words or try to defend the intervention anymore, and we ended the call without resolution, but without fighting either. I felt sad after hanging up, but also clear about my boundaries, knowing I couldn't let her back in my life until she truly understood what they'd done. I continued my law studies through the distance program, and kept working at Brian's firm, falling into a routine that felt productive and purposeful. Marcus and I started dating more seriously after a few months, going out twice a week and talking on the phone most nights. He met my support group friends at a social event and fit naturally into my life, joking with them and treating everyone normally without the awkward overcompensation some people did around disabled folks. He treated me as a complete person instead of a victim who needed saving, asking about my work and school and future plans like I was someone with real prospects. We went to concerts where he described the stage setup for me and restaurants where he read me menus without making it a big production. When I told him about my family and the intervention, he got quiet and then said that anyone who loved me should want me safe and happy, not back with someone who tried to kill me. A year after that horrible intervention, I was thriving in ways my family said were impossible. I had my own accessible apartment that I decorated myself with help from Kira and the support group, with everything organized so I could find it easily. I was completing my law degree with good grades and positive feedback from professors, working part-time at Brian's firm on cases that mattered, and dating Marcus, who respected me and made me laugh. I'd built a life that wasn't defined by what Kevin took from me, but by what I created for myself afterward. The support group women celebrated my 1-year anniversary of independence with cake and stories, and I realized I'd gone from that broken person in my childhood bedroom to someone who was actually happy most days. Janet reached out through a mutual friend saying she wanted to apologize and talk about what happened. The friend passed along Janet's message saying my sister had been doing her own therapy and realized how wrong the intervention was, that she wanted a chance to make things right. But I wasn't ready yet to open that door. Wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. I'd learned through therapy and support group that forgiveness had to be earned through changed behavior, not just words, and I didn't owe anyone access to my life just because we shared DNA. The friend seemed disappointed when I said no, but she understood, and I felt okay with my decision, even though part of me missed my sister. I graduated from law school through the distance program on a sunny Saturday in May. Brian offered me a full-time position at his firm starting the following month, with a real salary and benefits and my own caseload of clients. Kira and my support group friends attended my graduation celebration at a restaurant near my apartment, filling the private room with noise and laughter and congratulations. Marcus brought flowers that he described to me in detail, and Austin gave me an upgraded screen reader as a graduation present. I stood up to make a toast and thanked everyone for believing in me when my own family didn't, for showing me that disability didn't mean the end of dreams, but just a different path to reach them. Brian raised his glass and said I'd built a family of choice that actually supported me, and that was worth more than any biological connection. I felt the truth of his words as I listened to my chosen family celebrate around me, knowing I'd survived something meant to destroy me and came out stronger on the other side. Marcus and I started apartment hunting 3 months after graduation, looking for a place we could design together from scratch. We found a 2-bedroom unit in a building with other disabled residents and spent weeks planning every detail so I could navigate independently without constantly asking for help. We installed tactile markers on all the walls, organized the kitchen with specific zones I memorized, and set up voice-activated controls for lights and temperature. The landlord let us modify the bathroom with grab bars and a walk-in shower, and Marcus described where he put everything so I could find it easily. Moving day felt different from when I left my parents' house because this time I was moving towards something instead of away from something. Kira and Brian helped us unpack, and Austin came by to set up additional accessibility tech he'd been developing. My family still wasn't part of my life, and sometimes that hurt, but I was surrounded by people who loved me without trying to control me or push me back toward my attacker. Marcus never treated my disability as a burden, or acted like I should be grateful he stayed with me, and that made all the difference in how I saw myself. 2 years after that horrible intervention in my parents' living room, I work full-time at Brian's disability rights firm, helping other survivors escape toxic situations. Last week, a woman came to my office after her family pressured her to reconcile with the boyfriend who broke her spine, and I recognized that same desperate confusion I felt when my own family called that meeting. I told her about my journey and connected her with resources, and by the end of our session, she was crying, but also making plans to move into her own place. I still have hard days dealing with my disability and trauma, days when I'm exhausted from navigating a world designed for sighted people, or when phantom pains remind me of what Kevin took. But I'm living proof that your family's limitations don't have to define your future, that the people who love you most can sometimes hurt you worst, and that real love means supporting someone's independence instead of exploiting their vulnerability.